Story number 1. I wasn't lost. I was alone. And that's worse when the world shrinks to headlights and a ribbon of interstate at 2:00 a.m. The road felt like a ruled line across an endless black page. The silence on the interstate pressed into the cabin until even my breathing sounded borrowed. I first caught the glint behind me and told myself it was routine highway choreography. But every mile shaved off the night left those headlights in my rear view mirror. Not casual, not drifting, matching every lane change, every speed adjustment. I changed speed again. When I slowed to 65 to test my theory, the sedan slowed too. And when I sped back up to 80, it matched my speed with a metronome's patience, like we were lashed together by something I couldn't see and didn't want to name. Out here, the desert isn't empty. It's attentive. Vast expanses of scrub brush and rocky outcroppings held their breath between Lovelock and Winnemucca. And if you think the horizon is your friend, try asking it for help. So I tried the coward's wisdom. I took the next exit just to test my growing paranoia. They followed, and I realized it wasn't a coincidence anymore. Whoever sat in that blue sedan didn't share my destination. They were hunting me. The math of fear is simple. Distance shrinks. Time stretches. The Nevada Department of Transportation rest area at mile 125 sits in the middle of absolute nowhere. A glowing island of sodium lamps and concrete restrooms. A couple of picnic tables stranded in sage. I rolled in and felt the light slice me open. The sedan slowly cruised past the entrance. No hurry, just enough for the driver to stare directly at me through tinted windows. I parked with the engine on, the kind of compromise you make between running and resting. The only other vehicle in the lot was a sleeping semi-truck with California plates. The driver was a rumor. You'd think cell towers would dot the map like stars. They don't. I tried calling 911, but my phone showed no signal, and the desert made a private joke of it. The nearest town of any size was Winnemucca, an hour if you asked nicely. Lovelock dozed the other way. I was truly on my own out here. When fear can't find you, it studies you. Headlights approaching from the east folded over the blacktop, and the blue sedan had turned around somewhere down the highway. It slowed at the rest area entrance, then continued past again, this time even more slowly. The driver's side window eased down an inch like an eyelid, the pale outline of a face turned in my direction. Not a greeting, a measurement. I told myself stories to fill the space where help should live. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they were looking for someone else. But the night has a way of making the surrounding desert look like an endless black void, and my stories spoiled fast. A coyote called to nothing. The wind rustled through the sagebrush, and the picnic table answered with a fatigue. I understood. The restroom building was one of those standard concrete block structures that pretends to be shelter. The air tasted like iron and old coins. When the sedan came back from the west, from the direction of Lovelock, it didn't flirt with the entrance. It pulled into the rest area and parked at the far end of the lot, maybe 60 yards away, positioning itself between me and the exit back to the highway. The headlights went out, but the engine kept running. Inside, a glow like someone reading a manual for me There are only a few kinds of predators. The ones who chase and the ones who wait. This one did both. I watched the silhouette move, checking something, preparing something. The distance between us felt both too far for me to see clearly and too close for comfort. I had to choose the kind of regret I could live with, so I chose motion. I started my engine and drove straight toward the blue sedan. Not aggressively, but purposefully. I aimed for the ramp like I meant it. The sedan's headlights immediately came on, and it began to back up. Fear is bad at chess. I got between the sedan and the highway before it could trap me completely. The ramp threw me back onto Interstate 80, and the desert reclaimed my mirrors. As I accelerated, I saw the figure get out. A tall figure in dark clothing who stood motionless beside the car, watching me disappear into the night. If you've never been watched by someone who has stripped your choices down to one, you don't know how loud relief can stay inside the body. I promised myself I wouldn't stop until a different kind of light found me. I drove the remaining long stretch toward the state line with my fuel needle dealing in fractions. Out here, help might be hours away even when you can see the glow of it. My eyes learned a new religion. Rear view mirrors as altars, checking obsessively for that blue sedan. The desert offered me landmarks as if they mattered. Mile markers, counting like a metronome, 140, 135. Constellations of isolated ranch lights. A mining operation on idle. I kept thinking about the way the sedan had mirrored me earlier. They had maintained the exact same following distance, exactly 3 seconds later, like an invisible string. That's not curiosity. That's rehearsal. Night driving turns you into your own unreliable witness. Did I imagine the window lowering? Did I see the pale outline of a face or draw it onto the glass? Because I needed an enemy with edges? I pushed these questions down the throat of the engine and listened to its answer. Sometime after the border signs started dreaming about me, the lights of West Wendover rose, the Nevada-Utah border promising gas and aluminum light. I pulled into the first 24-hour gas station, like it was sanctuary, built from fluorescents and stickers. People existed again, other travelers coming and going, which is sometimes the same as safety, and sometimes just a better disguise for danger. I filled the tank with hands that had forgotten their alphabet. Even then, under a roof that hummed with bright fluorescent lights, I could feel the geometry of pursuit stretched across the miles behind me. The math wasn't finished. Somewhere in the darkness of the Nevada desert, that sedan was still out there, not mine anymore, still looking for its next victim on the lonely stretches of Interstate 80, where help is hours away and cell phone signals are nothing but wishful thinking. I sat in the car without turning the key, and for the first time, let the questions breathe. Who rehearses a follow for 47 miles and then stops? Someone rehearsing for a different stage. Someone who has studied the layout, the pool of sickly yellow light, the angles of entry and exit, the way a semi-truck driver can be a Schrodinger's ally, present and absent at once. Someone who wanted me to remember them. The clerk inside sold coffee and lottery dreams. I asked about mile marker Vol.43 as if it were a diner, and he shrugged, like all deserts are the same. But he did say this: out there, people forget they're people. He meant dehydration and drifting trucks. I heard something else. I slept in the car with the seat at a hurting angle, the kind of half-sleep that grabs at every sound. and names it wrong. Every set of headlights that turned onto the lot was a blue ghost until it wasn't. You can't live like that, I told myself. You also can. Morning made promises it couldn't keep, but I took them anyway. I drove on toward Salt Lake City, my sister's place, now more than a waypoint. The desert in daylight looks like a crime scene that's already been cleaned. Nothing to see. Keep moving. But the road remembers. A few hours later, curiosity burned a hole where fear had been. I exited into a small town diner with a brown highway sign sun-bleached above it. I asked the waitress about I-80 rest areas, about break-ins and assaults, about anything that would let me put the night into a box. She told me a story about a woman who ran out of gas between Fernley and somewhere that didn't bother with a name, about a blue car that stopped to help and didn't. The woman got away by being loud enough to wake a dog. Was it a sedan? I asked. She looked at me like most cars are sedans when memory is tired. Baby blue, she said. And I decided her memory was good enough to terrify me. I took my coffee to go. I checked my mirrors more than the road deserved. And I started to practice what I should have practiced the night before. What to do when a car matches every speed change with mechanical precision. How to diverge. How to create witnesses. How to let the predator know you can see it without giving it the glory of fear. Here is what I know now. And if you're alone out there, between towns that are more rumor than map, you should know it too. If a car is married to your following distance, break routine. Don't brake. Exit unexpectedly to a place with cameras and people. Not a rest area in the middle of nowhere. If you are forced into a quiet island, keep the engine on, nose pointed at your escape. Don't get boxed in. If you can, put a large vehicle between you and the hunter so that their angles become bad angles. If you can't, make your own angles. And if the window comes down just enough so you can see the pale outline of a face, understand, you don't owe that face a closer look. You owe yourself the math of survival. Distance times momentum. I still drive the I-80 sometimes. The desert is honest in a way cities can't be. It tells you how small you are and doesn't apologize. Help might be hours away, but the choice to move is always closer than that. Some nights, those headlights stack up behind me, and my heart practices its old drum. I don't try to be brave. I try to be busy. On the best nights, the road doesn't speak at all. On the others, I listen hard enough to hear the echo of a blue sedan asking for an audience. I don't give it one. I let the horizon have it. And I keep going, because in the end, the desert only hunts the careless. And I am careful now. So careful that I didn't feel safe until safety had been boring for miles. So careful that I still couldn't shake the feeling. Not because it's true, but because it keeps me alive. If you ever find yourself on Interstate 80 at a bad hour with the same blue sedan behind you, don't make my mistakes. Make better ones. Drive through the night to avoid the desert heat if you must, but give yourself better lights than sodium lamps and better allies than a sleeping semi. And if you need to, take the whole desert with you in the mirror, not as terror, but as proof that you chose to move. I did. And the night let me go. Story number 2. I knew I was being watched the instant the night pressed its weight on my shoulders. Something measured me, like inventory. Not a person, but a target off to the south. Mile marker 59 cut a cold notch in the dark, and the cedars breathed like animals. The feeling started as just an uncomfortable prickle and grew teeth. I could feel it testing my name, my pulse, my odds, but this was different. The light fell wrong, puddled and thin, and the spaces between the trees felt organized. I was only supposed to grab a restroom and a micro nap before pushing north. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:17 a.m. I'd been driving north from Dallas to Kansas City on Interstate 35, the long ribbon that stitches together heat, cattle, and insomnia. The forecast said the day would cook me alive, so I chased cooler air by night, coffee stacked like poker chips in the cup holder. Oklahoma's I-35 corridor isn't exactly known for its abundance of rest facilities, and that knowledge had been a pebble in my shoe the whole way. When fatigue finally caught up with me just past the Red River, crossing into Oklahoma, I told myself I'd pull off, refill water, use the restroom, and close my eyes for 5 minutes. No more. 5 becomes 15. 15 becomes your last decision. That was the voice I ignored. The sign announced the rest area ahead, brown and bureaucratic, promising a pause from the miles. The facility itself is one of those basic Oklahoma Department of Transportation setups. A block building, a few picnic tables, a small parking lot with spaces for maybe 20 cars. No playground laughter, no vending machines humming old love songs, just concrete, cedar, and whatever grows in the dark when no one looks. I cut the engine, and the night settled. The air had that high plains clean that can still carry rot. The Oklahoma countryside stretched endlessly in all directions. Low hills and fence lines like stitches pulling the land together. Endless is where people disappear because there's too much space for anyone to notice the missing. I stepped out and felt the gaze like static. It wasn't until I walked toward the restroom building that I realized the eyes following me belong to more than one person. Not the social weight of a bar or a classroom. This felt predatory, calculated, like a ledger was being updated with my arrival. Beyond the yellow pools of sodium light, the cedars ticked and breathed. Near the tree line, a dark-colored pickup truck parked at the far end. Engine off, windows that swallowed light. Something about its placement felt deliberate, like whoever was in it wanted to observe without being observed. I told myself I was being paranoid, because paranoia is cheaper than truth and far easier to pay. Inside, the restroom echoed with the stale music of industrial disinfectant. One of the ceiling lights was flickering intermittently, strobing shadows across concrete walls and making the corners complicate themselves. Corners are where decisions hide when they don't want to be found. I kept listening for sounds from outside, but all I caught were the occasional distant rumble of a semiter passing by on I-35 and the hum of the ventilation system chewing at the silence. Somewhere in that chemical rattle, I tried to convince myself this was just travel's usual theater. Truck drivers, long-distance trips, overnight parking. Nothing to see. Then the door groaned, and the night slid back in. Thinner now, stretched and humming. When I finished and pushed open the heavy metal door to leave, 2 new shapes had budded in the lot. 2 dark-colored sedans now sat on opposite sides of my car, boxing it like a museum exhibit. The occupants weren't visible, but I could see the faint glow of interior lights and the occasional movement of shadows inside. This is the part where you pretend not to notice, so they have to commit first. I walked as if an itinerary still governed me, as if I were the kind of person with a schedule even at 2:17 a.m. My heart rate spiked anyway. A bad drummer in my throat. On the far edge, the pickup's silhouette shifted. Its occupant had moved to the driver's seat, and the engine was running. Exhaust visible in the cool night air. The sedans sat with that calm that isn't calm. The plates were strangers. One from Arkansas, the other from Texas, arranged like parentheses to this empty acreage. The two sedans had positioned themselves in a way that would make it difficult for me to back out of my parking space. The math was simple. It always is before it becomes desperate. I angled toward my door, keys in hand. I heard the distinct sound of multiple car doors opening almost simultaneously. Soft footsteps on gravel. The kind of choreography that comes from practice. This isn't their first recital. I didn't turn around, counting footsteps moving in my direction. I reached 3, and then, not running, but walking with purpose. There are thresholds you don't cross. The space between your spine and someone else's hands is one of them. My hand hovered at the door handle and made a choice. Instead of trying to get into my car, I kicked into the only corridor with witnesses, the interstate. The ramp loomed like a lifeline, and I ran. Behind me, I heard the footsteps break into a run, and someone shouted something that shredded in the wind. The ramp rose, and above it, northbound lenses cut through the dark. I saw the headlights of a northbound scimitar approaching, and every sensible part of me lost the vote. I ran directly into the path of that 18-wheeler, waving my arms frantically to get the driver's attention. There's a noise air brakes make that divides a life in two. But what mattered was the cab stopping just a few feet from where I was standing. The driver, a middle-aged woman with concerned eyes, immediately understood that I was in trouble. She flung open mercy. She let me climb up into the cab and used her CB radio to contact the Oklahoma Highway Patrol. Her voice, clean, professional, unafraid. From that height, the lot became a board. Multiple sets of headlights moving around in the rest area parking lot before eventually leaving the scene, peeling off, heading in different directions on various local roads that branched off from the interstate. When the first cruiser found the exit, the game paused. When it turned into the lot, the rest area was completely empty, except for my abandoned car. The troopers knocked with discipline, not panic. They were the kind of men who bring daylight with them, even at 3 in the morning. Everything went measured. License, statements, the receipt of my fear. By the time the state troopers arrived 20 minutes later, the trucker kept me high and locked. The investigating officers found evidence of at least 4 different vehicles having been parked there recently. Tire prints like crooked signatures, along with what appeared to be surveillance equipment hidden in the tree line. Black plastic, glass eyes, wires threading soil to battery. The word surveillance tastes metallic when it's about you. The senior trooper was careful with his nouns. He didn't say cult or ring or crew. He didn't say cartel. He said location of interest, and several missing person cases involving lone travelers on I-35. He said they had never been able to establish a clear pattern or gather enough evidence to make arrests. The grammar of caution is the grammar of survival. Promise nothing. Imply everything. He asked why I had stopped at mile 59 instead of a truck stop, bright with sugar and cameras. I told him the truth. Oklahoma has been systematically closing rest areas over the years, and fatigue can turn a quick stop into a verdict. He nodded in a way that contained both sympathy and statistics. Then he gave me the commandments. Avoid isolated rest areas overnight. Stick to well-lit truck stops and travel centers with security cameras and multiple witnesses present. Never let your tank justify a bad decision. They escorted me back down into the lot, where the concrete block restroom building stood with its flickering gilt and the RV dump station that hadn't been maintained in years. Dawn was still hours away, but the air felt brighter with uniforms in it. My car waited between absence and relief. The trooper circled, crouched, photographed. He looked past the yellow pools of sodium light toward the cedars, where the wind had arranged the branches into the suggestion of hands. I told him everything again, this time slower. The way you recount a dream to convince yourself it wasn't. The sensation of being watched intensified with every step. I said, the way the dark-colored pickup had positioned itself to see me first and last, the way the two sedans had boxed me in, the footsteps that multiplied, how the on-ramp had felt like the only door in a burning house. He kept his pencil level and his eyes kind. He didn't tell me that luck, more than courage, is what separates agony from anecdote. When the paperwork paused, I looked at the restroom again and had the thought you get in haunted houses, that the building was both itself and something that had borrowed its shape. Some architectures are instructions. Inside it, the building smelled of industrial disinfectant mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant that now had a name: inevitability. I wondered how many phones had searched for a signal in there and found only themselves reflected in a cracked mirror. We walked the tree line where the pickup had been staged. The dirt told us it had waited long enough to plan. The trooper counted shoe prints, 3 at least, maybe 4, and pointed out how they'd worked the shadows to stay invisible from the road. He showed me the lay of the cedar and oak, thick stands of eastern red cedar that create deep shadows even in daylight, and how at night those same hills and tree lines become perfect concealment for anyone who doesn't want to be seen. The land wasn't complicit. It was merely useful. The trucker, her name was May, leaned on her bumper and watched our lesson. She drove the night like a profession and had more stories than miles. She said there were places she'd never park empty because the quiet there had teeth. She told the trooper about the brown highway sign and how she'd seen the headlights moving around before everything dissolved. She said, sometimes Angel looks like habit. You stop because you always stop. And that's enough to save a stranger. We waited for the tow, then decided we didn't need it. My car started clean as a prayer. The trooper offered a slow convoy north, red and blue, breathing against the cedars. I said yes, like a person who intended to keep existing. The pickup was gone, the sedans gone, the engine off. No movement visible inside, kind of gone, that leaves you guessing what you failed to see. As we pulled onto the ramp, I looked back only once. The restroom sat there the way a mouth sits when it's swallowed something it will never name. Some places don't take trophies. They take time. Maybe that's why they'd never been able to establish a clear pattern, because patterns comfort, and whatever lives out there prefers you uncomforted. The convoy ran 3 exits, then 4. The land rose and fell like it had nothing to apologize for. May's rig held steady in my rear view until she didn't. She blew by us with a horn that said, "Goodbye and be lucky." I watched her tail lights stitch themselves north. It felt wrong to let them go, but the troopers had a county line to attend, and I had a story to outlive. On the radio, the senior trooper gave me the study guide of surviving the road. Full tank, lit stops, park near cameras, multiple witnesses. Keep your phone on at least 1 bar of signal strength if you can help it. Trust your skin when it itches. I wanted an algorithm, a clear pattern. He offered only practice. If you think it's nothing, he said, assume it's not. The highway unreeled. During the day, you can see for miles across the gently undulating landscape. But at night, it's just a ribbon pulling you toward the version of yourself that arrives. My version replayed the lot in loops. The soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, the way sedans had positioned themselves, the exhaust visible in the cool night air. My mind kept replacing my rescue with another ending, the way fiction tests the hinges on the doors you closed. In those edits, the air brakes never screamed, the driver never opened her cab, and the Oklahoma Highway Patrol never wrote their names on the morning. I stopped at a travel center, fat with light and noise, the kind where coffee tastes like survival and the bathroom smells like citrus ambition. I stood under fluorescents and let my body remember. It was a body, not a statistic. He recommended that I avoid using isolated rest areas during overnight hours, and I heard it as scripture. I washed my face and watched the mirror refuse to lie. I looked like a man who had auditioned for the wrong part and barely been turned down. On a corkboard by the exit, there were flyers, 4 colors of the same grief, missing persons. The photos watched, because that's what photos do. Names anchored them to a grammar we believe in. Date last seen, height, distinguishing marks. I scanned for a pattern and found only lone travelers on I-35. The paper rasped under my finger and felt like bark. Back in the car, I adjusted the seat as if geometry could cure memory. I replayed. He recommended that I avoid using isolated rest areas until the syllables dulled. That's when the app on my phone pinged a stray bar into existence. I shouldn't have, but I searched mile 59 the way a tongue seeks a broken tooth. The results were the opposite of comforting, forums and rumor, and the kind of articles that keep phrases like flagged as a location of interest at the top of the page. Some threads proposed ghosts because ghosts are gentler than men. At the counter, a cashier with librarian eyes asked if I was the guy from the rest area. The question wore local gossip like a sweater. I said yes, but tried to make it sound like no. She said, "Don't stop there after dark." She said it easy, like, "Don't leave soup on the stove." Then she gave me a coffee on the house, which is how small mercies announce. themselves. Back on the road, the night thinned. I counted semis as saints and kept May's horn in my head. Every mirror made me a scientist, and every pair of headlights a thesis. When a black SUV hung in my blind spot too long, I changed lanes and left him behind. When a pickup matched my speed to the decimal, I exited and counted to 60. I wasn't afraid. I was rehearsed. The troopers peeled toward their jurisdiction with a dip of lamps that felt like a benediction. Alone again. I drove the rest with my jaw unclenched and my hands ready. The stars felt like porch lights now, not omens. The land lost its appetite. Sometimes you win, not by being brave, but by being finished. I reached my destination about 3 hours later than planned, but still intact, which is the only schedule that matters. Morning slipped across the motel lot and turned every surface honest. In bed, I didn't sleep so much as turn off. When I woke, I made the mistake of telling the story out loud to myself. The words arranged themselves in a logic that sounded rehearsed and that bothered me. As I drove away from that rest area, escorted by a patrol car to ensure my safety, I had already begun writing the version where I knew what each choice meant. I didn't. I called my sister. She said, "You were lucky." I told her, "Luck is just the bruise that proves the hit missed your bone." She said, "Promise me you'll stop at truck stops." I said, "I promise." We made jokes because jokes are the safety scissors we hand to terror, so it can't cut as deep. Later, the senior trooper left a voicemail, courteous, measured, reminding me to check in if I remembered anything else. He said if I passed back south, I might consider the new travel center near Paul's Valley. Cameras, lighting, people. He didn't say safety, but he made the outline of it. That night, I tried to work, failed, and ended up mapping Mile 59 on Google Earth like I could flatten it into a two-dimensional problem. The rolling hills, covered in scrub oak, looked harmless from orbit. The thick stands of eastern red cedar looked like parsley on a plate. It was only when I slid the view down to driver height that the deep shadows reasserted their arguments. A place can look innocent at every scale except the one you live at. A week later, May texted a photo from Nebraska. Sunrise, a cup of coffee, and the caption, "Keep moving." I sent her a thank you that sounded inadequate, because everything sounded inadequate. I have rehearsed the moment she braked more than any other. The calculus, the wait, the split second where she decided my body was an emergency worth her life. We talk a lot about heroes. We don't talk enough about professionals. When I finally slept without edits, my dream took me back to the heavy metal door, to the flickering light, to the faint glow of interior lights in cars that had names I never learned. In the dream, I did what I actually did. Ran. But when I got to the ramp, the headlights weren't there. Instead, the cedar line peeled apart, and what came through wasn't people. It was emptiness, shaped like men. I woke before the end, and sat a while with the story's ratios. Here's what I kept from that night. A set of footsteps, a shout I couldn't parse, the geometry of a trap, a horn, a woman's eyes in a cab gone gold with instrument light, and the instruction manual the trooper wrote in the air with his careful nouns. Here's what I didn't keep. certainty. The math is still bad. They'd never been able to establish a clear pattern. And patterns are how we forgive ourselves for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. On my last day, before turning home, I drove past a rest area in Kansas that might as well have been a chapel. Morning, families, dogs negotiating the politics of grass. I almost cried from the sight of multiple witnesses existing by accident. I parked, stretched, and let the prairie wind reorder my bones back south. I took the truck stops, did the sugar and cameras liturgy, and never saw mile marker 59 out my window again. But the land keeps what it wants, where screams for help would echo unheard across miles of empty countryside. There's a ledger somebody updates, maybe a man, maybe a memory, maybe both. I don't drive at 217 M anymore. I don't park in empty light. I avoid using isolated rest areas during overnight hours. I keep moving. That's the trick. I think, not outrunning anything, just refusing to give it a place to sit. And if you're reading this at some unfamiliar hour, pulled to the shoulder by fatigue and the sweet lie of a 5-minute rest, I figured a quick bathroom break and maybe a 5-minute power nap would be enough. Hear this with all the urgency my voice can carry without breaking. The ramp is closer than you think, and the driver you need is already awake. Story number 3. I pulled off the interstate because the storm scraped the sky raw, and I was running on nerves and caffeine. The first thing I noticed about the Restwell Motel wasn't the peeling paint or the broken neon, but the desert of empty parking spots where a full house should have been. Lightning kept photographing the building. A single-story box with a door marked 7 at the far end, and every flash made it look older, like the picture was aging faster than the subject. When I slid the key into the metal lock, I heard muffled conversation inside. The hush of people who don't want to be caught being real. I told myself I was exhausted. Told myself thunder carries voices. But my name isn't thunder. And I heard my name. I'd been westbound all day. Interstate miles humming under me. Denver hanging like a lit sign somewhere past the rain. Back near Russell, the weather had curled its hand into a fist. Marble-sized hail started pounding my windshield, and the advisory for central Kansas went from background noise to a personal letter addressed to me. I needed shelter fast. The Restwell rose like a mirage. A vintage promise, advertising clean rooms, color TV, air conditioning. Exactly the kind of weary optimism roadside America wrote to itself decades ago. 12 rooms total, L-shaped, with mine positioned at the far end where the building turned 90 degrees toward overgrown cottonwoods. The sign buzzed like a memory, trying to recollect itself. I thought, pick a key, pick a bed, pick a silence. Inside the office, a man with thick glasses and nervous hands worked the desk as if it might buck him off. He glanced at the back room between every sentence, surprised to see me, though I'd called ahead, and the air carried a low television or radio playing at low volume, the words too blurred to make a shape. He told me everything. Nearby closed by 9. Vending machines only. The clock pinned the hour to the wall like a butterfly. I signed, and he slid me room 7. Outside, the wind was doing choreography with the rain, driving it horizontally across the parking lot, and the walkway light shivered over chipped concrete. Curtains glowed in several rooms. That should have meant luggage, engines ticking cool, snack wrappers in the trash. But the lot was a stage without actors. Unless guests were parking elsewhere, I told myself, or had arrived by other means. My mouth tasted like metal. I paused at the door. Let the storm say its piece. And that's when the voices braided themselves through the weather. Voices, definitely human, speaking in hushed tones, ebb and resume, like tied against drywall. I knocked. Hello. Everything zipped into silence, except the roof drumming and the old bones of the building trying not to sigh. The lock turned like it had a memory of my hand. The room welcomed me the way a refrigerator welcomes light. Cold and without conversation. Sheets turned down. Air stale. Musty with industrial cleaner. All the cues of a place staged for a person who never arrived. The bathroom and closet held only their echoes. The window was latched from inside. No connecting door. No sign anyone had been in the room. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched the chain of the overhead light write little circles into the ceiling. The old CRT gave me 3 anarchic channels. Snow and late-night programming, oddly inappropriate for a family motel, as if some archive had sprung a leak. The AC rattled and wheezed like a chest with secrets. When I tried the phone, it answered me with a dial tone that sounded wrong somehow, too high-pitched and electronic. It felt like being listened to by the kind of silence that edits you. Time drafted me into its army and marched me nearer to 2 in the morning. That's when the walls began to remember. The voices returned, not from people physically present, but threaded through plaster and paint. They spoke about events that hadn't happened yet, discussed people I'd never heard of, mapped out room numbers and guest names with the intimacy of a ledger. I wanted to be angry. Instead, I was catalogued. They named a woman who once stopped in a thunderstorm and never checked out. They knew her hometown, her suitcase color, her private embarrassment at taking sugar packets for later. They recited a trucker's 2 divorces and 1 soft spot for old dogs. Then, like a knife deciding it prefers an inside pocket, they turned. They said my name. They quoted my conversation with the clerk, word for word. They described the storm by the phrases I had used to console myself. They reached childhood memories and fears I had filed in a cabinet I never unlocked. I did not feel haunted. I felt audited. I left with the same calm as a person exiting a burning building. I spent the rest of the night in my car, engine running, doors locked, wipers measuring the leftover rain. The storm was a tired god by then, muttering. At dawn, the motel looked even more run down, the pool empty and filled with debris, boards over several windows, weeds rehearsing for ownership. I folded myself back into the office to check out and met a new face, a young woman who told me the motel had been closed for renovations for the past 6 months. Her ledger had no record of me. I left anyway. On the on-ramp, I looked back. Room 7's door was standing wide open. Mouth of darkness, mourning in its teeth, refusing to swallow. I told myself to keep driving, and then I obeyed myself for once. You can fact-check the world until it gets embarrassed and changes the subject. I searched for online reviews or official records, for county permits, for satellite images with timestamps. Nothing wanted to be found. 6 months later, the place had promoted itself to an empty lot, overgrown with prairie grass, only a faded concrete foundation left like a chalk outline. After that, I didn't need Kansas to hear Kansas. The voices kept traveling better than I did. They set up shop in other roadside rooms, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and spoke when the HVAC found its rhythm, when the bathroom fan harmonized. They kept the same tone, quiet, confessional, administrative. They used my history like a key. They said, "You were afraid of failing your father's definition of useful." They said, "You bought a blue windbreaker when you were 12 because the tag said weatherproof, and you believed it." They said, "You've been driving west your whole life, even when the map curves back." I started testing them. I'd leave the TV on mute and ask questions in my head. About the man in room 3 who smoked at the rail. About the clerk who kept glancing toward the back room. About the grain elevators and abandoned farmhouses the lightning had signed. They answered with census bits and obituary flavors. They corrected me on the date of a flood I misremembered. They gave me 3 misspellings of Restwell from old ledgers. Rest well, rest well, rest well. They were bored and brilliant, and not interested in conclusions. The thing about a storm is that it collapses distance. Somewhere in central Kansas, dark air was still folding over wheat, where the highway cuts through endless fields. The motel, as a structure, could die. The ledger, as a function, did not need walls. If a traveler arrived with a secret and a storm, a motel could boot itself from nothing. If no traveler needed shelter, it could not be there at all. This was the only story that fit the evidence, which meant it was wrong in a way that comforted me. On the 3rd night after the empty lot, I tried to bribe the voices. I told them I'd trade names. They didn't want mine. They already had it. They offered a cadence instead. Showed me how they listen. Not to words, but to pressure. To the way fear ventilates a room. To how distance sounds when it pretends to be sleep. I gave them nothing, and they had everything. That seemed fair. They grew stranger when I stopped arguing. They told me about the clerk with thick glasses in great-grandfather tents, as if he were an ancestor of the building and not a man. They knew which vending machine coil jammed the peanut butter cups, which carpet cleaner recipe burned your throat less, which single overhead light cast harsh shadows, not because the bulb was cheap, but because shadows like to rehearse where nobody claps on a long stretch through Wyoming. I asked the question I had been avoiding. Who pays you? They paused the way the voices would pause occasionally, as if listening for something. Then they said, "You do. Every mile you buy, every decision you invoice to weather." They said, "The highway writes checks in lightning. We cash them in rooms." It wasn't profound. It was just accurate. So I learned to drive with a different hunger. I stopped looking for closure and started practicing check-in. I told myself that the receipt at a front desk is not proof you stayed. Only proof someone wanted you recorded. I put a notebook in the glove compartment and titled it, "Rooms I.O. I wrote, Room 7, Restwell, Kansas. Debt outstanding at a truck stop diner in eastern Utah. A waitress with a Storm's haircut asked me why I kept glancing at the corner where the security monitor hissed. I told her about the dial tone that sounded wrong somehow, and the bones in drywall that spoke actuarial love. She said, every road has a lost and found the size of a county. She said, people don't disappear, they get summarized. She topped off my coffee and left a napkin with a phone number on it. I never called, but the napkin became a kind of passport. The next time the voices woke me, they were kinder. They did not lead with my mistakes. They started with every good stop I'd ever made. The night I pulled over for a stray dog. The morning I paid for the car behind me at a toll. The time I returned a dropped wallet with more cash than my own. They sounded like a hotel chain that had decided, late in its life, to become a church when sleep came. It came like a front desk light dimming to night mode. I dreamed a blueprint, lobby as throat, rooms as lungs, a storm as the breath that threads them. I dreamed a line of road about 15 miles west of Russell and 30 east of Hayes, and a door that stood wide open because some distances are more honest that way. Morning always forgives me for the bargains I make at night. In a motel near the state line, I woke to sun that made everything look more run down. But still, it counted as morning, and I was grateful. I opened my notebook, Rooms I.O., and wrote another entry. Tonight, I pay something back. Payment, it turned out, was a kind of listening you can only do when you stop reserving escape routes. I killed the TV, let the AC rattle and wheeze, lay on the coverlet like a held breath, and asked the room to say my name if it wanted me. It didn't. It said someone else's, a name with coal dust in the vowels. It told his story, westbound, like me, hail in the mirrors, like me, room 7, like me. It said he called his mother from the office phone and apologized for leaving before he learned how to stay. It said the motel kept his apology because it fit the decor. Then the room did a thing that made me respect it as a liar. It gave me an ending. It said he checked out. It said he drove to Denver and made it to his cousin's couch and slept under a blanket that smelled like oranges. It said he got a job and learned to steam milk and forgot how to be scared when giant thunderheads stack over the plains. Maybe that happened. Maybe the room was trying to tip its own scales. I thought about the swimming pool, empty and filled with debris, and how all emptiness does is hold what falls into it. I thought about fences and county lines and railroad easements, how they perform ownership that land barely recognizes. The voices came back like a closing shift and said, "You are not being haunted. You are being accounted for." I accepted the invoice. I said, "Fine, print the charges." They tallied. One night, in a bed that remembered better sleepers. 1 hour of safety I did not earn. One confession whispered to a wall that didn't consent to priesthood. One exit I claimed as victory when it was only weather break. The final line item read, "Attention." I couldn't argue. I paid by listening harder. Restwell taught me there are buildings you can't Google because they're not interested in being found. They're interested in finding you. They publish themselves in rain bands and vacancy signs and front desk bells that never ring because the only guest tonight is the one already here. If you try to take a picture, the flash ages the frame. If you try to make a map, the paper turns to receipt stock. So this is how I live with it. I stop pretending I'm the first person to be read aloud by drywall. I stop asking if the motel was ever really there at all. I accept that some places exist only when desperate travelers need shelter from storms that might be more than just weather. I keep my debts in the glove compartment and my kindness where the world can invoice it. On the anniversary of that night, I drove back to the empty lot, overgrown with prairie grass. I parked where the lobby might have been and watched the light fence itself around blade tips. If you stand still long enough, the plains will lay a hand on your shoulder. I said thank you out loud. The lot did not answer. The lot had subcontractors for that. I walked the foundation like a slow prayer and tried the door to room 7 out of habit. It was, of course, standing wide open, which is what a door becomes when the building that gives it meaning retires. I stepped into the rectangle and let the wind do what it does best, turn explanation into weather. I waited for the voices. They waited for me. When they spoke, they surprised me by using the word we. We are the hush people make when strangers can hear. We are the range of your fear turned into translation. We are the clerks with nervous hands, the guests behind drawn curtains, the grainy black and white movies nobody chose but everyone recognizes. We are rooms learning how to be mouths. We are what wakes when you knock and say, hello. I asked if they wanted me to stay. They told me, you're already here in all the ways that count. They told me to drive on because miles are the only language some of us learned fluently. They told me to carry room 7 like a wallet photo, worn at the edges, proof of a time when shelter recognized me and let me recognize it back. I drove until the sky exhaled. Somewhere after the state line, I realized a truth so small it fit in the ashtray. Not every story wants to be solved. Some want to keep you company while the weather makes up its mind. On a clean stretch of interstate, I said my name like a person clocking in. The highway didn't answer, which is how I know it heard me. That night, a different motel took my card and printed a receipt that didn't prove anything except a willingness to leave a record. In the room, I wrote one more entry. Rest well debt, paid in attention. I turned off the light and let the dark furnish itself. The voices discussed travelers and their secrets in the other rooms of the world. They did not need me. I slept anyway, which felt like checking out without leaving. Story number 4. I was chasing distance more than destinations when the desert began to listen back. There's a point on a long road where your thoughts stop being private. Out there, the stars feel like audit lights, and I had reason to fear audits. I'd left Phoenix with the ledger of a betrayal in my glove box and a tight, hungry quiet chewing on my nerves. They say you never forget the smell of human fear. They're right. I caught it somewhere north of Black Canyon City. Thin at first, like a penny on the tongue, a copper film over the night air. It edged into the car and sat in the passenger seat like it had paid for the ride, and standing outside that gas station in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, at 3:00 in the morning. I finally understood what they meant. I wasn't planning to stop. But the fuel light blinked its little sermon, and the building materialized where the highway fell into darkness. Low, tired. A single-story building with 2 pumps under flickering fluorescent lights. Something in me whispered, "Keep going." Something older answered, "You know you won't." Sometimes you need miles of empty road and star-filled sky to make sense of betrayal. But sometimes the road makes sense of you. I rolled in. The gas station appeared like a mirage in my headlights. The asphalt looked like shed skin. Hand-painted signs hung in the windows, stubborn, decades old. No other cars were visible, which wasn't unusual for this time of night, on a road that most travelers avoid in favor of the interstate. Yet the emptiness felt curated, like a table set for one. I stepped out and let the desert swallow the engine noise. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s, and the lights stuttered like a nervous eyelid. When I tried to start the pump, nothing happened. No chirp, no ask for payment, just an indifferent slab of buttons gone to sunburn. I tried the other pump. It stared back as if I'd offended it. That's when I saw the paper on the glass. Pay inside, cash only, attendant required. The handwriting trembled, as if the letters had been written during an earthquake that never ended. Every rule I trust on lonely highways. Stay outside, stay visible, stay moving. Leaned away from the door. But the gauge on the dash was a teeth-baring truth. I went in. I tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The bell didn't ring. The air did. I was immediately hit by that smell. Fear mixed with something else. Something organic and sweet. A spoiled bloomer crushed under a tire. The air inside felt thick and wrong, like it hadn't been properly ventilated in weeks. Dust clung to the shelves. Bags of chips had faded to a uniform beige, like they'd taken vows. "Hello?" My voice felt taxed. "Excuse me." I called out to the person behind the counter, because there was a shape there, not moving. An elderly man slumped in a chair, keeping a vigil no living person would choose. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, his skin waxy and gray in the dim light. His eyes were open, but vacant. On a horizon I could not see. His mouth hung slightly open, as if he'd been trying to speak when whatever happened to him had happened. I didn't run. I negotiated with my legs and lost. I backed away from the counter, my mind trying to process what I was seeing, while my instincts screamed at me to get out of there immediately. Yet curiosity is a traitor dressed as a friend. Betrayal had taught me that already. That's when the store breathed. That's when I heard the sound from the back room. Not quite a voice, not quite mechanical, but occupying that wrong geography in between. It was a low, rhythmic sound, like breathing, but too regular to be human, too organic to be machinery. It had moisture, it had cadence, it had a listener's patience. It had me. The sound seemed to be responding to my presence, getting slightly louder and more frequent as I stood there listening. The dead man didn't explain the unlocked door. The lights didn't explain the dead man. The breathing didn't explain anything at all. It merely collected explanations from me, like tribute. None of it made sense in a way that suggested rational explanation. Outside, the desert waited like a judge. Inside, I was suddenly not the most interesting life in the room. I thought about my partner's Irregularities. That soft word for a sharp knife. Numbers had been moved. Signatures had been lifted. The money trail funneled into a shell that wasn't a shell at all. Something with teeth in the corporate filings. I had started this drive to decide whether to burn the friendship or the company. This felt like a place where normal rules had been suspended. And I wondered, do rules suspend themselves? Or does something cut the rope? Behind the counter, a register paper curled like a tongue. Shelves lined the walls, obedient and still. On the wall, a clock insisted it was 3:00 in the morning. But the second hand quivered, refusing to commit. The silence is so complete, you can hear your own heartbeat. Except there was more than one rhythm now, and only one of them was mine. I tried words. Sir? Nothing. I'm going to call. The figure behind the counter didn't move, didn't acknowledge my knocking, because I hadn't knocked. I realized that had been earlier, somewhere else, some version of me who thought doors meant help. I looked at the handwritten sign again. Pay inside, cash only. A price list below it said ice $2, AR $1, and something someone had added in pencil. Attendant required. The breath from the back answered me in 3-count phrases. Sometimes pausing, as if listening, then resuming with what sounded almost like satisfaction. It knows you know it knows. The thought arrived without my permission. I inched sideways, keeping the back room's doorway in the milky corner of my vision. I've spent time in server rooms. Cool air, regulated hums, machine lungs trained to a metronome. This wasn't that. This was the heat of a living cellar. And the regularity wasn't the precision of a clock. It was the appetite of a tide. The breathing sound from the back room changed rhythm, becoming more excited, more anticipatory. And somewhere in my chest, a small, rational man started packing a suitcase. I saw details then. The tape holding the sign in place was yellowed with age. But the corners were clean where the tape had been replaced. Recently. Through the grimy windows, I could see the interior of the store dimly lit by what looked like a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. But there were new scuffs in the dust near the back door. Drag marks in parallel, as if something had been pulled in or out. Twice, the dead man's hand rested on the counter. His fingernails had a faint gray moonscape to them. Tucked under his palm was a roll of cash, a 20 on top, as if to say, you can still buy things here. My own wallet felt suddenly like bait. I forced myself to move, to back slowly toward the door, while keeping my eyes on the entrance to the back room. An awkward dance of retreat and surveillance. Outside, my hands shook in anticipation of the key. The ignition, the secular salvation of combustion. But I wasn't the first traveler to stop at this gas station in the night. I could feel that knowledge in the way the building regarded me, as inventory. At the threshold, I made the mistake of looking straight into the dark slot of the back room. The breathing paused. The pause was a smile. Then it began again, closer in tone, the resonance flattening like something had adjusted to my height, my lungs, my pace. It knew I was there and was pleased about my presence. I stepped into the night, and the heat accepted me, the way a fever accepts a confession, without judgment, without cure. As I pulled away from the gas station, I looked back in my rear-view mirror and saw the lights make a decision. One by one, they went out, not popping or dying, but agreeing to stop. The pumps surrendered their glow last. As if reluctant to leave me with the dark, I turned onto the empty ribbon of highway. Wind knifed through the open window, bringing me the sage of creosote and the desert wind, and, God help me, the faintest continuation of that tide-lung rhythm. The breathing sound followed me for miles, braided into the sound of tires, reminding me that some places exist outside the normal world of maps and highway signs. Story number 5. I was 14 miles from the fence line when the patrol lights bloomed in my rear view, and the desert went silent inside me. The state trooper pulled me over exactly 14 miles from where I'd left the cult compound. The sentence wrote itself across my skull like a warrant. He walked up slow, and the moment I saw his face in my side mirror, I knew they'd already gotten to him. Something hollow lived behind his pupils. That same vacancy I'd seen in gas station smiles back in Redemption. Arizona, the radio on his shoulder crackled. But what answered wasn't a dispatcher. It was a church. His eyes held that same vacant stare I'd seen in the gas station attendants back in Redemption, Arizona. I'd watched that stare ripple through the town like heat mirage over asphalt. A little desert town that doesn't appear on most maps, but should, because if a place plans to advertise salvation with hand-painted signs, you deserve the warning label. I had been running for 3 days straight, sleep-deprived enough to taste copper, carrying nothing but the clothes on my back and a wallet containing $47 in cash. It started as carelessly as a yawning driver. A wrong turn off Interstate 40 near Flagstaff. A detour sign pointing me into narrower, lonelier arteries of the desert. The sun went down like a dropped coin. My radiator decided to give up completely, and the Honda sighed into a stop. Welcome to Redemption. Population 127. God's country, the sign said. The town consisted of maybe 30 buildings clustered around a main street that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. And when I rolled to the single pump, people emerged from buildings, faces arranged as politely as Sunday school, but with that butcher's appraisal, the way people look at livestock being evaluated for purchase. The first hand extended was Brother Michael, a mechanic with clean fingernails and the soft-spoken cadence of a lullaby. We'll order parts from Phoenix. A few days. The Lord provides, he told me, and it landed wrong in my gut, like a pebble swallowed with water. They housed me in the guest house, an adobe box, clean and comfortable, but with no telephone and windows that didn't open properly. Meals were communal. Everyone sat together and held hands, and Brother Samuel, who wore authority like a second skin, led prayers that went on longer than seemed necessary, pausing on words like purification, chosen ones, and those who have been called to serve. At first, I chalked it up to small-town fundamentalism, the sort of insulation that passes for faith in quiet places. But patterns form if you stay still. Conversation stopped when I entered a room, and resumed as a whisper tied after I passed. No one in town seemed to have last names, only brother and sister, the honorifics stapled even to children. The town had no television, no radio, no internet, no newspapers, as if the world had been loosed from its hinges and they preferred the quiet. When I asked to call home, Brother Samuel smiled like a photograph and told me they preferred to maintain separation from the corrupted world, and that my arrival was part of God's plan. On the third night, they invited me to attend what they called a testimony meeting. The hymns began like any small congregation, thin voices, stubborn faith, and then turned. People confessing to crimes they couldn't possibly have committed, speaking in tongues. Others interpreted their babbling as divine messages. The air felt rehearsed, yet feral. Brother Samuel presided over it all with an intensity that bordered on the manic. Eyes bright, a conductor tuned to rupture when they called me up to confess my sins and accept purification. I performed. I sold them the low-sodium version of me, that I was lost and finding direction, that I was seeking meaning, that I was grateful. But Brother Samuel wasn't satisfied with generalities. He wanted names, dates, the ways I'd served the devil in the outside world. The congregation pressed in, faces expectant and hungry, and the church shrank around me to a wooden throat. That's when I saw the wall. Not a mural. Photographs, dozens of pictures taken in the same desert. Men and women of various ages, expressions of peaceful acceptance, but bodies posed with the stiffness of decisions made for them. Some faces snagged recognition, the way a thorn takes cloth. Missing person reports I'd maybe seen on highway billboards or milk cartons. Brother Samuel caught me staring. These were the blessed ones who had completed their journey, he said, achieved perfect purification. After, 2 men escorted me back to the guest house and let the distinct sound of a lock engaging narrate their departure. Through the bad window, I watched the town change clothes, men moving with purpose, carrying tools and supplies, women bundling cloth, children practicing a chant under their breath. The floor told me a different story. A loose board, a cache, driver's licenses, credit cards, jewelry, and cell phones. Names like Jennifer Martinez and David Thompson and Sarah Chen. The room went cold. The town's hospitality had an inventory list. The next night, the cleansing ceremony bled the town into the desert. Fire confessed. Plastic burned chemical prayers, and the systematic destruction of worldly possessions turned into applause. I waited for the town to blink. Then I was motion slotted into darkness, breaking the guest house latch with an iron leg from the bed frame. Made it to where they'd hidden my car, whispering to the engine until it answered on the 3rd try. I ran without headlights for a long geography. When I did risk light, the road ahead looked like forgiveness. Forgiveness, it turns out, is easily impersonated. But they'd found me anyway. The thought wrote itself when the state trooper with a vacant stare pulled me over on a lonely stretch of road. He parted the night with his flashlight, like a priest lifts a veil. As he approached my car, I could see other vehicles emerging from hiding places along the roadside. Dusty silhouettes I recognized, the same dusty pickups and SUVs I'd seen parked around Redemption. All those benevolent smiles, filing their teeth in the dark. He asked for my license with the warmth of a vending machine. The badge looked real enough, but it floated wrong on his shirt. as if the fabric refused the lie. Too clean for someone working Arizona highways. The radio on his shoulder coughed static, and when he reached for his radio to call in my license plate, I heard not codes, but scripture. Not dispatch. Brother Samuel, I've never been a brave person, just a stubborn one. The stubbornness kept my voice steady. I handed over my license, let my hands shake only in my lap, and looked past him to the shoulder of the road. The desert was a black ocean, but oceans have currents. Between Mesquite and Ocotillo, I saw movement. A woman stepping out from a pickup bed, someone I remembered from the prayer circle, Sister Ruth, who had held my hand too tightly before grace. She carried a coil of nylon rope in a way that suggested tradition. "Step out of the vehicle," the trooper said. There are instructions that feel like open graves. I opened the door and let the desert night touch my face. Dry, cool, moth-sweet. I kept the door between us like it could be a shield. He guided me toward the shoulder, and I counted. 3 pickups, 1 SUV, 1 sedan I didn't remember, and the church in the shape of a man at the back, Brother Samuel himself. No robe, just a travel jacket, and a gaze that shook like a tuning fork. "We worried," Samuel said softly, as if we'd shared a childhood. "You left before your purification, but the Lord provides detours." Behind him, Sister Ruth tied the rope to a T-post. Someone unloaded a lantern. Shadows repeated us on the ground like rehearsed sin. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked. A real question wears down into a prayer. Samuel's smile was tender, and therefore terrifying. Refusal is a verb for the outside world. I looked at the trooper. Empty rooms live behind some faces. "You're not police," I told him. The flashlight shook once, a flicker of personhood, and then stilled. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The night did the math. Here is what I knew. I could not outrun a ring. I could outwait a moment. "I need water," I said, and wet my lips with the last of my voice. Someone passed a canteen. I drank like a penitent. Then I coughed, stepped half a pace back, and let the canteen slip into the dust. A small clatter to draw 4 eyes downward. I moved, not away, but through, pivoting past the trooper's shoulder into the gap between the 2nd and 3rd pickup. The desert is a lesson in negative space. If you look at what isn't there, you find a door. A shout went up. No sound effects, just breath and feet. I didn't sprint. Sprinting is a confession. I went low and quiet along the berm, hands and knees, feeling the sand tell me where it had last been disturbed. I found a wash, shallow, braided with beer cans and old tire tracks, and let it carry me parallel to the highway. Every dozen beats, I froze. The lantern swung. Shadows scanned. A coyote somewhere issued an opinion about my odds. A hand found my ankle. Sister Ruth. We both knew each other's names by then. I twisted, kicked, not with fury, but with geometry, and her grip loosened. The trooper's beam bit the wash. I went still, let my body become a shape the desert already owned. Then the beam moved on. People are poor at distinguishing motion from meaning when they've been told how the night works. I reached the culvert at mile marker 212. Numbers have mercy sometimes, and slipped inside. Breath a string pulled tight across my chest. The highway rumbled above like a complicated thought. I crawled until the smell changed from dust to rust to something like time. On the far side, the culvert shouldered me into a stand of creosote. Beyond it, fence wire, sagging like an old verdict. I climbed, bled a little, learned my blood still knew its job. Back on the road, the lights had reassembled into a plan. The trooper was speaking into the radio. Words like lost sheep and bring him home, carrying in the stillness. I wanted a witness, a real one. Headlights crested far off, not their vehicles. A long-haul truck sang its approach. I stumbled into the lane, not to die, but to be seen. The driver saw me. Brakes wrote a hot paragraph in the night. The horn spoke the only sermon I respected. I got 1 foot on the step before the pickups moved. The trucker shouted something I couldn't keep. And then hands had me again. Polite hands, church hands. The trooper approached with the slow certainty of scissors. "Listen," I told the trucker. "Please, they're not police." He looked past me at the badge and made the human mistake. Trusting what shines, Samuel leaned close enough for me to smell the desert in his clothes. "You're tired. Redemption is rest." "No," I said. "Redemption is a trap that learned manners." Something changed then. The trooper's radio, their radio, finally caught a frequency it didn't own. A second voice broke in. Not scripture and not code, but a bored professional tone asking for unit numbers. The trooper stalled like a thrown gear. The spell, if that's what we call a town's consensus, stuttered. I did the smallest, brave thing I could. Reached, took the microphone, and said the truest sentence available to me. "Officer down." I lied, because sometimes lies are splints. Mile 212, possible abduction attempt. The radio got busy in a hurry. The trucker's eyes recalculated. Sirens are just instruments. But tonight, they were the right key. Samuel exhaled. A man who knows the scene is ruined. He let go first. The pickups began to peel away, casual as dust devils. The trooper looked at his badge like it had betrayed him by being metal. I held the mic until a real cruiser's lights painted the desert new. When they asked for my statement, I gave them the story plainly. From Los Angeles to Albuquerque, a detour, redemption, testimony night, the photographs, the cleansing ceremony, and the cash under the floorboards. I watched their faces for that vacancy. I didn't see it. I wanted to believe that mattered. They didn't find the town. Not that night. Towns like that fold themselves between miles when you aren't looking. But they found the guest house later, and the floorboard, and the names. The case will go on in ways I won't. I sleep with the radio now, the real kind, muttering weather and traffic, and people who are paid to be bored. I carry a jug of water, even in cities. I keep my car in over-maintenance, like it's an animal I owe a debt to. Sometimes, I drive east on purpose, to remind myself the horizon is a choice. Mile 212 is just a number again. There's a blackened ring in the desert near there, where someone once burned possessions to feel pure. Creosote grows through it now, as if the earth were accepting an apology I haven't learned to make. You want an ending with the cult raided, the leader arrested, the town disassembled into statistics. The desert doesn't do tidy. It does patience. It does examples for others to follow in the form of warnings, not saints. On nights when the wind is right, I still hear a choir where there is only freeway. I returned once, not to the town, to the absence where it had been, in daylight, cautious as an animal drinking. The highway's shoulder wore no new scars. A county map pretended ignorance. A ranger I flagged down told me there's no redemption in this quadrant, just a wildlife study area and a lot of private land the government is tired of arguing about. He offered me a pamphlet about heat stroke. I took it because paper is a kind of truth. I kept driving until I found a church that looked normal, brick and disappointment. I sat in the back and listened to a sermon about forgiveness from a man who'd never had to ask for it properly. On the wall hung pictures of mission trips. The faces were smiling, the poses voluntary. I thought about the blessed ones who had completed their journey, and the way an image can be both a record and a threat. If you ask me what redemption was, I'll give you the taxonomy I learned too late. It was a system for taking lost people and telling them their lostness was a calling. It was a ritual that used purification as a pretext to erase whatever name the world had given you before. It was no last names, no television, no radio, no internet, no newspapers, because a mirror might break the spell. It was a guest house that had no telephone and windows that didn't open properly, because air is a vote. It was Brother Samuel, who believed harder than is healthy for any mammal, and who learned how to borrow law enforcement costumes the way children borrow Halloween faces. It was Brother Michael, who kept his hands too clean for a mechanic. It was Sister Ruth, who tied knots like a liturgy. It was me, arriving with $47 in cash and a radiator that relieved me of choices at night now. If a car follows me too long, I measure the distance in small prayers. Reach a town, pass a lit billboard, find a station that plays traffic reports. I am gentler with detour signs. I respect the wind when it carries voices. There's a story I didn't tell the officers because it felt like I'd imagined it. On the second day in redemption, a child, sister, something, they called her. I never learned her first name, slipped me a folded tract at lunch. Inside, scrawled in pencil, was a single sentence. If you run, don't run straight. I don't know who taught her that. I don't know if she made it out, or if she believes she needs to. I've kept the tract. It's creased into geography. I think the trooper might have been two people, the uniform he was wearing and the man underneath it. When the real radio voice came through, I saw his face move, like a lake when a fish turns. Maybe he remembers me as a problem he almost solved. Maybe he prayed later. Maybe he never thought about it again, because the town collected him back like a tithe. It's dangerous to believe in maybes, but maybes are part of how I keep from turning off my own stations. This is where I say what I learned, because every survival wants to be a curriculum. I learned that when a place tells you what you are before you speak, you should ask who benefits from that prophecy. I learned that a locked window is a thesis statement. I learned that the systematic destruction of worldly possessions is a convenient way to make evidence smoke. I learned that Population 127, God's country, is less census than spell. And I learned that the desert keeps secrets, not because it is cruel, but because it is enormous and has no pockets. If you ever find yourself on Interstate 40 near Flagstaff, and a sign points you down a road your map doesn't name, take the long way. If you must turn, leave breadcrumbs that radios can hear. If you must stay the night, memorize the floor. If someone asks you to confess a sin you can't remember having, tell them their question is too intimate for strangers. And if a trooper pulls you over 14 miles from a place you shouldn't have learned existed, check the uniform for dust. Real work leaves marks. I keep my car clean now, but I keep a little dust on the dash as insurance. A reminder that all deserts are connected by the people who survive crossing them. The dust knows my hands. It knows the handle of a door that once pretended to be a shield. It knows the weight of a hand-lettered sign promising more than it owned. I have not found a name for what I escaped, other than the obvious one. And the obvious one is a door that always stands ajar. Redemption. Some nights, when the radio goes quiet between stations, I think I hear a voice say, "The Lord provides." And I answer, not the way I did back there, not with a smile that hid an exit, but with a new liturgy I wrote in a culvert. The world is wide, and I am still here. Then I change the station. Then I drive. Story number 6. I tell stories to stay awake. Some are true. Some are almost true. And a few won't let me sleep after I tell them. This one still rides shotgun when the road goes empty and the asphalt turns to October glass. I was rolling south out of Kansas City, fighting that familiar heavy feeling behind my eyes. The one that says you either park or you become a line in a DOT accident report. Lebanon's pilot off exit 126 has saved my hide more than once. What saved me that night wasn't coffee. It was a truck that refused to blink. A pristine Peterbilt sat in the back corner, engine still running, diesel whispering into the cold. Every other rig slept. That one watched, and when I walked up to say, "Hey, driver, everything okay in there?" something inside shuffled like a hand hiding a card. I've been a long-haul driver for 12 years, hauling everything from auto parts to frozen foods through 38 states. And the highway knocks certain instincts into you. You learn the smell of overheated brakes before smoke shows. You spot the nervous rookie drifting over the fog line. And you know when a rig is perfectly positioned, not for rest, but for surveillance. That Peterbilt had backed in with military precision, angle set for a clear view of every vehicle coming or going, shadowed just enough to avoid the overhead sodium lights and the foot traffic. It was a chess move, not a nap. From my stall by the building, I kept it in the corner of my windshield while I knocked out my electronic logs and murdered a microwave burrito. 45 minutes, give or take. The truck driver hadn't moved from behind the wheel, not to stretch, not to check his cargo, not even to use the restroom facilities. The plates were wrong too. Freshly issued shine, temporary tags in the rear window. Guys who can afford that paint job don't usually run temps, not unless they're trying to be someone else tomorrow. I told myself it was professional courtesy. Sometimes a man has a medical emergency or a busted coupling, and his pride won't let him ask for help. So I left the light and walked toward the dark, closer in. The cab's interior lights were off, curtains drawn tight. The engine's steady rumble said somebody was inside. awake or pretending. I rapped the door and spoke the line I always use when I don't know what I'm walking into. "Hey, driver, everything okay in there?" The answer wasn't words. It was the rapid, deliberate shuffle of a body changing places. Too fast for waking. Just right for hiding. Silence fell. Except for the idol. My breath made a pale halo. The cold had that dry Ozark bite that gets inside your teeth. That's when it hit me. The smell. Not the usual cocktail of rubber, coffee, and diesel fuel. This was sweet and cloying. The afterbreath of a butcher shop on a losing day. It came from the trailer, not the cab. I drifted back along the length of the reefer. The seals on the rear doors were wrong. There was a gap of maybe half an inch. Any reefer driver will tell you that's a marriage between your cargo and the devil. Cold leaks, product spoils, bills go bad, and if the cooling system is failing, you're on the horn, begging roadside service like salvation. Whoever sat in that tidy cab wasn't dialing anybody. I put my ear to the gap. At first, I thought I heard a low humming or buzzing, like tired fans chasing a temperature they'd never catch. Then, irregular, a pulse that wasn't mechanical, a murmur, voices, not one voice, multiple voices, wrong pitch for a radio. I couldn't parse the words, but the cadence was unmistakable. Conversation. The smart thing would have been to back away, make an anonymous call, and let Missouri State Police play the hero. I even turned half around to do just that. But the whole situation felt wrong enough that I couldn't just ignore it. The mysterious driver who wouldn't respond to knocks. The improperly sealed trailer with a strange smell. And somewhere in there, human voices getting swallowed by refrigeration. I circled to the front again, trying the windshield angle for a peek. But the curtains held. That was when the Peterbilt made its first move. A subtle nudge of the wheel, the nose shifting position slightly, like a watcher settling his elbows on the table. Small enough that if you weren't already suspicious, you'd miss it. Big enough that I knew I was now part of the scene. I went back to my cab, shut the door without slamming, and made the call. The dispatcher sounded tired in the way only midnight can make a person tired. "They'd send a trooper," she said, "but it might take 30 to 40 minutes. Pile up west of Springfield had everyone stretched thin." I thanked her, gave the details. Interstate 44, just east of Lebanon. Back corner of the lot. Temporary tags. Engine still running. Then we waited. The Peterbilt and I. Two idling hearts in a half-empty lot where business had been slow lately. Where the unseasonably cool weather had knocked the buzz out of everything. I watched the rig through glass, and the rig watched me back through curtains. I think about the things people hide in trailers. I've hauled cherries that had to be held at 32 degrees, or they'd bruise in the crate. I've hauled insulin where a 10-degree swing could mean death at the pharmacy. I've heard stories, some true, some to scare rookies, about legitimate cargo-riding shotgun with something else. A pallet with nothing but air inside. Except the air was full of money, or pills, or something alive that shouldn't be 20 minutes in. The engine note changed. From patient idle to driving RPM. No stop for fuel. No coffee. No shower. The Peterbilt slid out of its stall like it had someplace better to be. It didn't head toward the building. It headed for the exit. I felt my left hand reach for the keys before I thought it through. I'm not a cop. I'm a man with a schedule and a stubborn streak. But the line between the two gets thin when you hear voices in a cold trailer and smell a sweet, cloying odor that doesn't belong to anything you can sell. I eased out as if I were just another rig making time. The Peterbilt rolled west, tail lights steady, the kind of steady that dares you to follow. I told myself I'd shadow it only as far as the overpass, long enough to feed the trooper a mile marker worth something, long enough to keep whoever was in that trailer inside the story. 2 miles on, the night opened into that Ozark grade where the interstate dip and the wind turns sly. I held a truck length and kept my lights polite. The Peterbilt held speed like cruise control had been nailed to the bulkhead. Then, without brake light or signal, it glided onto the ramp for a county road that barely deserved the name. That was my second chance to quit. I took the first curve anyway. The road narrowed, trees shouldering in, no shoulders to speak of. If you drop a wheel, you donate your axle to the ditch. The Peterbilt didn't mind. It moved like it knew every camber and crown. And somewhere between the curve and the creek bridge, a thought got into my cab and sat in the passenger seat like it paid rent. What if the voices weren't trapped? What if they were waiting? Story number 7. I keep my hands at 10 and 2 because ritual holds when reason breaks. If I let go, I'm afraid the road will notice. My wife disappeared between mile marker 83 and mile marker 97 on Pennsylvania State Route 6. I can say it without breathing. It feels like a prayer carved into bone. They said adults have the right to change their plans. They said voluntary missing person, like paperwork, could cauterize a wound. It didn't, so I drove. 14 miles, 2 lanes, a green tunnel where time forgets itself. I drove until the odometer stopped meaning anything on my 183rd run. The fog found me. When I came out, I was 50 miles away, parked at a rest area the state swears was closed for renovations. In the grass, a phone. Last dialed, 9:27 a.m. October 23rd. Rebecca's house. Precision is all I have left now. I count facts, measurements, and documented evidence the way monks count beads. My wife disappeared somewhere between mile marker 83 and mile marker 97. I repeat it because the words are a metronome that keeps my heart from breaking rhythm. I have driven that 14-mile stretch of highway approximately 237 times in 8 months, and the numbers line up like guardrail reflectors at night. They don't comfort me, but they keep me aligned with the lane. October 23rd. State College to Wellsboro. Sarah left at 7:15 a.m. in her silver 2019 Honda Accord, Pennsylvania license plate HBJ 4829, with an overnight bag and an apple pie for her sister's birthday. The math says 2 hours and 20 minutes. An arrival near 9:35 a.m. Rebecca called me at 11:45 a.m. asking where Sarah was. By then, the pie would have been lukewarm, the crust soft with the kind of patience that breaks hearts. The Pennsylvania State Police told me adults can change plans. 24 hours before missing turns into missing. They took the report. They promised patrol units would watch for a silver Accord. They suggested I drive the route myself in case of mechanical problems or unreported accidents. So I did. I drove slowly from Gaelton to Wellsboro and back, stopping at every gas station, convenience store, and front porch with a wind chime. I asked about a woman matching Sarah's description. I heard no and sorry, and haven't seen her, and I learned how many ways there are to say nothing. Route 6 through this section of north-central Pennsylvania is what locals call the loneliest highway. A two-lane road threading ridge lines and creek valleys through dense hardwood forest that runs unbroken to the horizon. In October, leaf peepers pull over with cameras, but on weekday mornings, it's loggers in pickups and the occasional long-haul trucker cutting between Williamsport and Corning. Cell phone coverage is spotty. Dead zones last 20 or 30 miles, and GPS drops out in valleys where the canopy hides the sky. This is a place that edits you out of your own life without leaving red marks. When Sarah didn't answer by noon, I turned ritual into procedure. I examined every turnoff, every pullover, every place a car might leave the pavement. No tire tracks, no broken guardrails, no debris. Nothing that says something happened except the shape of what now isn't. They interviewed me, her friends and family. They checked financial records, surveillance cameras, social media. Her bank accounts remained untouched, credit cards unused, accounts inactive, no marital problems, financial stress, mental health issues. The file closed with the stamp voluntary, as if a word could hold back the noise. It didn't hold back the nights, so I built my own grid. I drove between mile markers 83 and 97 at different times of day, in different weather. I documented everything with photographs, GPS coordinates, detailed written notes. I mapped every logging road, every hunting trail, every abandoned structure within 5 miles of the highway. I hiked when I had to, a man counting rings in the dark. I interviewed hunters, fishermen, hikers, local residents. Some were reluctant, but their silence curved around a truth like a river around stone. Between 1987 and now, 17 people had disappeared along this 14-mile stretch. Daylight hours, traveling alone. No physical evidence. The intervals were irregular, years apart, then months. But the shape matched. A stencil pressed over us all. Pattern is comfort until you realize you're inside it. Near Pine Creek Gorge, the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon, the talk bent weirder. Sudden unfog banks without meteorological explanation. Temperature drops on clear, warm days. Electromagnetic disturbances that turned radios to snow and strangled cell phone signals. Wildlife behavior, off-kilter. Deer avoiding the shoulder. Birds refusing to nest. Dogs agitated in back seats. One old man said the gorge kept its own barometer. And when it fell, people did too. I kept records, because precision is what I have instead of sleep. And yet, on my 183rd search run, the record-keeping went sideways. Clear morning in June, 9:00 a.m. I was eastbound toward Wellsboro when the fog appeared like a wall slid onto the highway. It hadn't been visible from a distance. Later, weather radar showed nothing. Inside it, visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. I guided by centerline and guardrail reflectors. My car's electronic systems malfunctioned. Dash lights flickered. The clock paused. The audio died. and time itself went elastic. I heard voices in languages I didn't recognize. Syllables drifted like moths against the windshield of my skull. I came out not where I should have. I was nearly 50 miles down road, idling at a rest area Sarah likely would have used. Picnic tables, weathered and broken. Restroom building boarded up. Weeds shouldered through cracks like slow green knives. Penn Dot Records later said the facility had been closed for renovations 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance. Renovations that look a lot like forgetting in the grass. A cell phone. When I powered it, the last number dialed glowed like a lighthouse. Rebecca's house in Wellsboro, 927A. October 23rd. I didn't breathe. The pie in the back seat of that hour had steam in it. The world hadn't decided yet. I say these things plainly, because drama is a luxury for people whose lives still happen in sequence. Mine has mile markers. The first rule of after is that you're already living in it. The second rule is that you'll rewrite the before until it fits. I used to believe the highway was a stage, and we were just the matinee. Local traffic, loggers heading to work sites, the occasional long-haul trucker using it as a shortcut between Williamsport and Corning. But the fog made the stagehands visible. Something stands behind the curtain of Route 6, and sometimes it leans on the ropes. I took the phone home inside an evidence bag I bought online, because I can't stop being precise. The case was scratched. The battery, somehow, still took a charge. There was no SIM, no photos, just an outbound log. Rebecca, 927A, M. I played the voicemail on Rebecca's landline, once, twice, then a dozen times, listening for Sarah's particular breath before she speaks, the half laugh she puts into certain vowels. The recording was only hiss and a long distance tone, like weather happening in a wire. But beneath it, I swear I heard the soft shift of the driver's seat, where she always tucked her foot under her thigh. I went back to the rest area with a tape measure and a notebook, the way some men bring flowers. The picnic tables were weathered and broken. The restroom building was boarded up. Weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt. I logged GPS coordinates. I measured board widths, 2x6s, mostly spruce, because the mind needs nails to hang on. A crow watched from the light pole and refused to blink. When the wind luffed, it smelled like pennies and damp cedar. If you'd asked me a year ago whether 17 people could vanish in daylight without leaving tire tracks or broken guardrails, I would have said no. Now I know how much absence weighs. I've felt it buckle the center line under my tires. I've watched it lean into the hardwood forest until birds refuse to nest. Adults have the right to change their plans, the trooper said. He has never met a plan that eats the map. I widened my interviews. The hunters gave me dates and weather. The fishermen gave me water clarity and temperature. The hikers gave me trail conditions and the way dogs behaved near the gorge. One woman, a school bus driver, told me she'd seen fog banks roll uphill against no wind, and once her bus radio filled with voices that weren't dispatch and weren't any language she knew. She said the kids went quiet all at once, like birds before a storm. The state police closed Sarah's case after 6 weeks, and the paper called it the end of the story. Stories don't end. They crater. I still talk to the lieutenant at Mansfield. And he still reminds me that cell coverage is spotty at best, and that GPS devices frequently lose satellite connection under a canopy like that. When he says phenomenon, he means weather. When I say it, I mean something that knows we're looking. I started testing the fog, like a bruise. Different times of day, different weather conditions. If temperature dropped sudden on a clear, warm day, I set the odometer and drove. If my radio reception fuzzed, I marked the mile. When wildlife angled away from the shoulder as if the road gave off heat, I slowed and watched the guardrail reflectors whisper by. The worst feeling in the world is passing your own car in the opposite lane and not recognizing it. It took weeks to find it again. And then the fog showed up with the entitlement of a landlord. I entered at marker 86, and the world folded. Not a drift or a bank, but a corridor. Trees erased into chalk, pavement narrowed, sound thickened. My center line went a shade less yellow, like it had been photocopied too many times. The voices were back, some lilting, some guttural, each syllable landing somewhere between my ear and the glass. A woman said something soft in a language I don't know, and the part of me that belongs to Sarah answered without words. I watched the dash clock tick 9, 6, 9, 7, 9. And then time did that elastic thing again. Stretched, not skipped, like it was testing the fabric to see how far it could go before it tore. My electronic systems malfunctioned in sympathy. The lane keep assist chirped. The speedometer lagged. The audio promised a song and delivered silence. I whispered facts to myself. State College, Wellsboro, mile marker 83, mile marker 97. Like a man entering a password. When the fog let go, I was parked. Same rest area, same boarded-up building. The crow on the light pole had moved 3 inches, and the world treated that as progress. I didn't find a new phone. I found absence arranged differently. Footprints that began at the restroom door and ended at the weed line. A quarter pressed into the asphalt, so deep the eagle's head had flattened. A paper map in the trash with Route 6 highlighted and mile marker 97 circled twice. I took photos. I took the map. I left the quarter because some sacrifices need witnesses. That night, I put the 273 words I've kept of Sarah on the table. State College, Wellsboro, October 23rd, 7:15 a.m. Silver, 2019, Honda Accord, HBJ 4829, apple pie, sister's birthday, loneliest highway, dead zones, center line, guardrail reflectors, rest area, closed for renovations. Last dialed 927, Rebecca. And I arranged them until a door appeared. Words make shapes. Shapes make thresholds. I don't know if the fog is weather or phenomenon or something unnatural that learned to read our signs. I only know the door is between 83 and 97. And I am a man who has learned to arrive by entering disappearance. Tomorrow, I'll drive again. I'll keep my hands at 10 and 2. I'll follow ridge lines and creek valleys. I'll listen for voices I can't recognize and answer with the only language I have left: precision. If the fog opens, I'll step through. If it doesn't, I'll leave a trail you can count. Story number 8. I am alone with the coast and the clock. The ocean is a rumor on the other side of the guardrail. The fog is not weather. It is intention. Somewhere ahead, 3 small figures wait in the beam of my headlights, and I should have kept driving. But I pressed the brake and gave the night my name. I was rolling south on Oregon State Route 101, speed needle steady. The kind of midnight run I'd made so many times. It felt like muscle memory. The children appeared in my headlights at exactly 11:47 p.m. 3 silhouettes, cut from the wall of gray fog, standing motionless in the center of the northbound lane. No houses for miles. No tail lights. No porch light. No witness but me and the Pacific, whispering out past the dark. What made the sight wrong wasn't just the suddenness. It was the way they didn't behave. No startled movement. No attempt to get out of the road. No flinch at a 2-ton car angling down on them at 45 mph. I knew this stretch by heart. The cliffs, the Sitka spruce leaning like old men in a storm, that ribbon of asphalt threading the forest with a single white seam. On a clear night, you might catch glimpses of fishing boat lights far offshore, but tonight, the marine layer pressed in so tight, visibility dropped to whatever your headlights could illuminate. It felt like driving inside a lung. I hit the brakes. The belt locked. Coffee lifted and let go somewhere behind me. The Honda Civic skidded to a stop, maybe 25 feet from where they held their line. They appeared to be between 8 and 12 years old. 2 girls and a boy. Clothes old-fashioned. Stiff little dresses and knickers out of a black and white memory. They stood the way kids don't stand, perfectly still in formation, like the picture had been taken and someone forgot to tell them they could breathe again. My hand went for the door. The other hand didn't let go of the wheel. Something about the scene held me frozen behind the wheel. Engine idling, my hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to leave marks in the vinyl. Their faces were visible inside my beams, but wrong in a way I couldn't name. Too calm for kids standing in the middle of a highway at nearly midnight. Eyes not on me, not on danger, but staring past me down the road toward Bandon, as if time itself were late for an appointment. There's a rational voice I carry for emergencies. It told me these were real kids who needed help, runaways, or shocked survivors from a wreck somewhere off the shoulder. But deeper than reason, that other voice, the one I inherited from animals and bad nights, said no. It said this is not that. It said the pattern is wrong. These children weren't behaving like any living kids I'd ever encountered. And the longer I watched them, the more the world seemed drafted wrong. Lines doubled, shadows misprinted. I tapped the horn. The sound seemed to die in the fog, a muted puff, flat and ineffective. Nothing from the trio. I flashed my high beams. The light hit them like stage lamps hitting props. No response. I noticed then that the fog around them moved like ink in water, in patterns that didn't match the gentle breeze touching my cheek through the cracked window. The air had a taste, metallic and old, like licking a coin. And because the night had already pushed me into memory, I found myself recalling stories I'd heard over the years from other locals. Call-in tales to late-night radio, fishermen and logging truck drivers claiming that sometimes children were seen standing in the road at night. always in groups of 3, always in the same general area between Bandon and the Coquille River mouth. You hear a thing enough times, and you build a drawer for it in your head. I kept mine shut. Until now, I work the Coos Bay to Gold Beach route every other weekend for my mother's appointments. Habit is a religion out here. Habit keeps you alive. But at night, it becomes a different creature entirely. The road, I mean. And creatures have appetites. The folklore said the 3 belonged to a family that never made it south a century ago. A winter storm, an automobile, carbon monoxide turning parents' warmth into poison, the children wandering into the storm and perishing from exposure. Some versions claimed the remains were never recovered. Death stories root well in coastal soil. Salt and myth are both preservatives. The more I stared, the more the scene matched the time period described in the stories. Old-fashioned clothing, behavior, like a needle stuck in the last groove of a record. I should have backed up. I should have turned around, headed for Gold Beach by inland roads. Instead, I did what I always do. I waited for reality to remember itself. It didn't, after what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably only 3 or 4. The children began to move. Not a step, not a shuffle. They seemed to glide backwards off the roadway, as if a film were being rewound. But the rigid postures stayed. The faces stayed. And something behind them tugged at the fog like unseen fingers. The marine layer tightened its spiral, and in those curls of vapor, I saw shapes that resembled faces and reaching hands, not in a horror movie way, not a jump, but in a quiet, insistent way that made my body want to be anywhere else. I kept my seat. I kept the engine alive. I kept pretending I could decide what came next. I want to say I'm a practical man. I believe in maintenance schedules and grocery lists. I believe in paid invoices and checking the tide. But I also believe in my mother's stories from a girlhood where the world was thinner in places. And if you whispered at the seam just right, something whispered back. This was one of those seams. It had the feel of a door you can see only when it's already closing. I braced my elbows on the wheel and followed the trio with my lights. The beam broke where the guardrail started to curve toward the ocean, and that was where they slid into the wall of fog beyond the guardrail, the way cold breath disappears in winter air. You can tell yourself they stepped down a maintenance path. You can tell yourself a turnout took them. The map in my glove box would like you to, but the map doesn't print certain routes. I listened. Highway silence is never silent. There's tire noise, engine tick, the far percussion of surf. Under that, there was something else. What sounded like voices calling out in distress. Too faint to carry meaning. Words too distorted to understand clearly. Like radio caught between decades. And the fog, which had been merely heavy, became saturated with history. If you've ever opened an attic and smelled old newspapers after rain, you know the scent. It filled the car. I should tell you, I was brave. I should tell you, I got out. That I checked the shoulder with my phone flashlight, called 911, wrapped my jacket around some shivering kid who said, "We lost our parents." That would be a better story, the sort you can fold around a moral. But truth is a colder fabric. I stayed put, not paralyzed, chosen stillness. There are moments when the rules we understand don't always apply. And this was one. So I let the night pass through me. I let the fog keep what it had come for. A minute later, or maybe a year, something in the air pressure changed, like a door sealing. I exhaled without meaning to. My hands finally loosened their death grip on the wheel. And for the first time since the clock read 11:47, I felt time resume its work. That was when part 2 of the strangeness began. Story number 9. My transmission gave out at the worst possible place it could have chosen. Mile marker 247 on Louisiana State Route 82, deep in the Atchafalaya Basin. I didn't need a mechanic to tell me that much. The road itself said it in heat and silence. The engine was still running fine, but when I leaned on the gas, I got nothing that resembled movement, only a grinding sound, and the slow realization that I was marooned above a black ocean made of trees. Midday light should have rescued me. Instead, Spanish moss filtered it into a green dusk, the kind of dimness that makes you wonder if time has stopped, even at midday. You have to understand something about Route 82 out here. It's not a break-down and walk kind of highway. It's a raised roadway on pillars, a concrete sentence underlined by water. There is nowhere to go but forward or back, and both directions feel like a dare. I checked my phone. Absolutely no signal. The screen might as well have been a mirror, showing a man who'd just stepped off the map. That was the first hush. The second was older than roads. The road runs like a concrete thread across a maze of cypress swamps. And that afternoon, it stitched me to nothing but water, cypress trees, and alligators. The road sits on concrete pillars, maybe 10 feet above the water level, high enough to see the glinting pools and the Spanish moss that blocks out most of the sky. Heat pressed on me like a hand. With the humidity, it felt closer to 110, and my shirt clung like warm soup. I tried the obvious. I pressed the gas pedal. Nothing happened, and I wasn't going anywhere under my own power. I tried the engine again, listened, and learned what denial sounds like when it wears a timing belt. Somewhere in that metallic scrape, I heard a clock with no hands. The smell of overheated metal drifted in through the vents, and I knew I was looking at a major mechanical failure. I pictured a tow to Morgan City, the bill devouring my week, the sun devouring the rest of me. Behind me, the road stretched back toward Morgan City, about 12 miles, hazed by heat. Ahead, it drifted toward Berwick, maybe 14 more miles. A ribbon with no bow, just endless swamp. No other vehicles were visible. That wasn't unusual for mid-afternoon on a weekday, but it was cruel timing. Out there, you might be waiting hours for a Mercy to wear headlights. I stepped out. The guardrail was the only fence standing between me and water that looked black as coffee. From my elevated position, the swamp opened like a cathedral nave, pillars of cypress, chandeliers of moss, pews of lily pads. The homily was distance. That's when I saw it. The boat. It was drifting slowly through the cypress trees, about 100 yards off the north side of the highway, and it moved without any visible means of propulsion. Not wind, not current, I could read. Something else. It was an aluminum fishing boat, maybe 14 feet long, and a single occupant sat in the stern, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I didn't want to finish. The person appeared to be an older man, wearing dark clothing. I raised both arms, a drowning gesture made on dry concrete. "Hey!" I called, and I walked to the guardrail, hoping to get the boatman's attention. "Hey, over here." But the figure in the boat didn't react, didn't turn, didn't seem to weigh anything more than a coat draped across a chair. The boat continued its silent drift with an almost supernatural ability to avoid obstacles. It threaded trunks that looked too tight to pass. It weaved between the massive tree trunks as though the trees parted for it. I followed along the shoulder, pacing its glide. I continued to call out, but got no response. A different kind of silence took over, the kind that edits you out of the scene. The man's posture never changed, too rigid, too exact, hands resting on his knees, facing straight ahead, never shifting position. His clothing looked old-fashioned, and his skin had a waxy grayish color that wasn't the kind you survive. The boat was in remarkably good condition. No visible damage to the hull, no accumulated debris, no fishing gear, no motor, no oars, nothing that said purpose. It was as if the boat and its occupant existed solely to drift through the cypress groves, keyed to a metronome older than tide. I kept it in sight for maybe a 1/4 mile, and then it disappeared behind a particularly dense grove of cypress trees and Spanish moss. I waited. It never did emerge. The place it should have reappeared stayed empty, like a skipped beat in a song. The silence that followed was complete, except the distant sound of my truck's engine cooling down and some occasional splash underneath the highway. Alligators, I told myself, or large fish, or something that doesn't care which word we use for it. Standing there, I began to understand why people who work in the oil fields tell stories about the Atchafalaya Basin that have nothing to do with wildlife or industrial accidents. There's something about this landscape that feels fundamentally different, older, and more primitive, as if the normal rules of civilization don't quite apply. The Spanish moss made permanent twilight. The water that surrounds the roadway is dark enough to hide anything, and some things hide by being seen. I scanned the water until my eyes ached. Time dilated. No prospect of rescue in either direction. When the world decides you are the only person on it, even your heartbeat starts to ask permission. At last, I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle, a pickup truck from the direction of Berwick. My tongue tripped over the way locals say it and the way I had read it on maps. It was the first traffic I'd seen in over an hour. I hurried back to my disabled truck and flagged him down. The driver rolled down his window, a middle-aged Cajun man with graying hair and concerned eyes. He took in the scene, the hazard lights, my sweat-salted shirt. He asked if I needed help. I tried to explain my situation, and then, like a fool, I told him about the strange boat. He listened while the truck idled patient as a dog. Then he said, "You best not worry about what you see out there in the basin, friend." He didn't blink when he said it. "Some things been drifting through these waters a long time, and they ain't got nothing to do with the living world." He offered me a ride to Berwick to call for a tow. I took it. As we pulled away, the swamp kept its face. But I had the feeling it knew my name now. He introduced himself as Armand. distinctive accent of South Louisiana turned warm by road noise. The cab smelled faintly of bait and coffee. "Folks who break down out here," he said, "they learn to keep to the ribbon. Concrete's for the living, water's for everything else." I asked the only question a rational man can ask after watching a miracle refuse to be seen. "What did I see?" Armand chewed on that. "Depends on what you brought with you." He let the sentence sit. Outside the window, cypress trees stood like courthouse pillars, trying old cases. The Spanish moss wrote cursive arguments across the sky. As if the normal rules of civilization don't quite apply. I felt that again. A courtroom without a judge. "Back when my granddaddy worked a trapline," Armand said, "men told one another about a single occupant in an aluminum fishing boat, man sitting motionless in the stern. Some said older man. Others said the features were hard to make out. Always drifting slowly. Always no motor, no oars. If you call out, he won't answer. If you go toward him, the water finds a new shape, and you can't quite reach. He'll pass, weaving between the massive tree trunks, and then he's gone." People talk about a body lost in high water. People talk about a ferryman without a fare. But mostly, he said, glancing at me, people stop talking. I tried to laugh, but the smell of overheated metal still hung in memory. And beyond it, something older. "You see him yourself?" "Twice," Armand said. "Once when I was a boy. Once when my brother didn't come home." I waited. We found the pirogue upside down, snagged on a cypress knee. We didn't find Michel. He shifted on the seat, hands steady at 10 and 2. Day after the funeral the parish got, I took my skiff out, just to see if the water would say something different to me. Out by mile marker, I shouldn't have been near. I saw the boat, aluminum, maybe 14 feet long, and a man in the back who wore my brother's posture like a borrowed coat, too rigid, hands on his knees, facing straight ahead. If he had a face, the swamp kept it. Armand's mouth tightened. I called to him, got no response. He drifted between two trunks that were closer than my shoulders, and then he was gone. He looked at me once, quick as a match. I came back to concrete. I married. I laid down habits you can load in a truck bed, but every now and then I smell lilies and outboard fuel where there ain't neither. That's when I drive the long way around. We rolled over a seam in the bridge, and the truck shivered. Not a sound effect, just the honest register of old concrete. And I realized I'd been listening for the occasional splash beneath us. The swamp had its own metronome. You either fall into time with it, or you step outside of time altogether. "Why keep going?" I asked. "Why live in a place that asks that much?" Armand nodded toward the tree line. "Because it gives that much. Because some truths are big enough you can't show your back to them. And because some questions ain't meant to be asked." His words settled over me like Spanish moss hanging from every tree. Lighter than they looked, heavier than air. I thought of how quickly a man can become a passenger in his own life. How easy it is to sit very still while the water decides. We hit the turnoff. Berwick lifted out of the heat like a memory of towns. On the edge of service station shade, Armand parked, and we climbed out into oppressive heat that felt a fraction kinder for being shared. Inside, I made the calls. Transmission shop in Morgan City. Tow on the way. Price like punishment. With that handled, I bought Armand coffee and a slice of whatever passed for sweet in a cooler. He didn't want to be paid for the ride. "Just don't go down there," he said, chin pointing toward the basin. "Not for the story. Not for a dare. And if you ever see that boat again, let the water keep what the water keeps." I promised. The kind of promise a man makes after the world has clarified itself by taking one option off the table. But the mind is a revolving door. And as the sun slid toward evening, I found myself thinking in ways that made the back of my neck cold. What if the drifting boat wasn't a warning? What if it was an invitation a man must decline every day of his life? That night at the motel, I knew better than to sleep. I propped the door with a chair and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the air unit breathe in an old man's rhythm. Out beyond the parking lot, the swamp began where the sodium lamps admitted they were simply burning. I told myself stories simple enough to hold. Raised roadway, concrete pillars, nowhere to go except straight ahead or straight back. I did not tell myself the other stories, the ones about something else in the water that preferred not to be named. Sometime near dawn, I dreamed. In the dream, I was back at mile marker 247, and the heat wore me like a coat. I walked to the guardrail and looked out, and the boat was already there, right where a man would find it if destiny had good manners. Single occupant, older man, dark clothing, waxy grayish color. He looked like remembrance sculpted out of candle smoke. I said nothing. I simply watched. He never shifted position, and yet it felt like he turned toward me in a way that didn't require turning. Then I woke to the sound of tires on gravel. The tow had arrived. The truck climbed the raised roadway, with my dead transmission riding behind like a whale shark on a sling. The driver, a man with forearms like boat cleats, kept up a stream of shop talk until the swamp silenced us with a view across open water. The morning made promises it couldn't keep. Clouds stacked like courthouse files. I asked him what I had asked Armand. "You ever see anything weird out here?" He grinned. Define weird. I didn't. Instead, I watched Spanish moss show us how to move without hurrying. The tow rig hummed. My thoughts did the other thing. We crossed the 26 miles of swampland between Morgan City and Berwick again. And my mind replayed details, the way a witness changes his testimony with the same facts. The boat maintained its steady drift, not left, not right, almost as if it were following the road beneath us, a parallel pilgrimage. If that boat had purpose, it wasn't fishing. If the man had purpose, it wasn't remembering. Maybe their purpose was the drifting itself, a kind of sacrament in motion. At the shop, I signed paperwork that looked like bad news written in numbers. The mechanic shook his head at major mechanical failure and made a timeline of days I didn't have. I booked another night. That evening, with the rebuilt silence of a small town pressing in, I did what Armand told me not to do. I drove back out, not far, just to where a man can still retreat without lying about it. I parked on the shoulder and stood behind the guardrail, and I kept both hands on the metal as if it were a handrail on a storm ship. I did not call out. I listened. The swamp said maybe 100 different ways and meant no each time. There were occasional splashes. There were distant sounds of engines where civilization pretends not to fray. The air felt older and more primitive than my reasons. Light folded. Tension gathered like rain before rain. Then the water accepted a new line, far off. Between cypress trees, I could swear to this in court. An aluminum fishing boat took shape exactly where there wasn't room for it a second before. Maybe 14 foot long. Single occupant, sitting motionless in the stern, hands resting on his knees, facing straight ahead. No motor, no oars, no cooler or tackle box, no effort to steer. The drift began like a sentence that already knows its last word. I let it come as far as it wanted to come. When I raised my hand in greeting, I did it slowly, as though the gesture belonged to someone careful of old rules. The boat slid through a particularly dense grove of cypress trees and Spanish moss, weaving between the massive tree trunks. Every clearance measured in whispers. It disappeared behind a curtain of green night. It never did reappear where Euclid said it must. Instead, the water resumed being only water, which is the most unnatural thing it does. I remembered Armand's last words to me. Long as you stay on the highway and don't go looking for trouble in the swamp, you'll be fine. The line sounded like advice until I realized it was a geometry problem. Concrete, straight ahead or straight back. Water, anywhere else. Choose your plane. I stood there until the mosquitoes promoted themselves to decision makers. Then I walked back to my borrowed sedan and, without ceremony, drove to where neon could vouch for me. That night on the radio, graveyard hour, Adam Stone, range on the dial. A voice told a caller to keep both hands on the wheel, to outrun only the stories that insist on riding shotgun. I lay there in the motel's artificial weather and said amen to a voice that would never know my name. In the morning, I retrieved my truck. Transmission, renewed by human hands, and warranty. The mechanic, good man, asked if I'd had any other trouble out there. I said no. I paid. I shook his hand. On my way out of town, I slowed when Route 82 climbed again, a concrete thread drawing a straight line across the basin. Nowhere to go but forward or back. I stayed on the ribbon. It's not that I believed or disbelieved. It's that belief didn't enter into it. A mile past where I had broken down, the light did a polite thing, glinted off water. Reflex made me glance left. There was nothing but water, cypress trees, and alligators. There was no visible means of propulsion. There was no boat, and yet I kept both hands on the wheel. I kept my eyes on the lane. I let the swamp decide what it wanted to keep. I let some questions remain unasked. By the time I reached Morgan City, heat had settled into ordinary. My phone regained its signal and swarmed with voicemails that belonged to the world where invoices and calendars live. I returned calls, lined up a job, told a friend I'd be late, told myself I would never again run that stretch without a service check and an extra bottle of water. But at a red light, I saw a man in a parked John boat in the corner of my vision. Just the shadow of a posture, upright, hands on his knees, facing straight ahead. It was only a stack of crab traps. It was only a trick of angles. It was only everything I had learned. I drove on. The ribbon held. Story number 10. I wasn't losing my mind. The road was. That was the only sentence that made sense when the mountains began to trade places like card sharps at a silent table. At 3:30 a. Colorado State Route 149 didn't just twist. It rearranged its curves and landmarks while I was driving through them. And the mile markers were counting backward. My GPS swore I hadn't left the highway, but I'd passed the same abandoned gas station with the "closed for repairs" sign more times than a lie can be told with a straight face. The asphalt felt solid. My hands were steady. My truck hummed like any other long night drive. But the peaks on the horizon had switched positions, and somewhere between Creed and Lake City, the road became a loop that didn't want me to arrive. My family likes to joke I plan my life with a carpenter's square. Under normal circumstances, I'm the kind of person who plans routes carefully and doesn't take chances on unfamiliar roads after dark. That Thursday, the slab we were pouring in Creed ran late. The mixer delayed. The mountain light already slipping toward September winter. We didn't wrap up until nearly 9:00 p.m. And Route 149 is the only real option for getting from Creed to points north and west. I told myself I'd be fine if I set a steady pace. Coffee hot enough to cauterize doubt during daylight hours. It's a scenic drive through aspen groves and alpine meadows. A ribbon that makes strangers confess they might move to Colorado for the views alone. But at night, especially in late September, Route 149 becomes something entirely different. A 2-lane mountain highway that disappears into darkness where the drop-offs are sensed, not seen. It takes nerve to keep your speed when your headlights carve a world that ends 20 yards ahead. The first sign that something was wrong came around mile marker 67, out past Creed, when I noticed the odometer had stopped advancing, even though I was maintaining a steady 50 mph. I own an old Ford. Quirks don't scare me. I thought maybe it was a mechanical glitch, some electrical whimsy, but when I checked again after what felt like another 20 minutes of driving, the odometer reading was identical, and my fuel gauge hadn't moved either. Machines tell the truth, even when people don't. Mine refused to, so I did what the careful do. I started paying closer attention to the mile markers. They weren't following the normal sequence, sometimes increasing by 10 or 15 miles, sometimes decreasing, sometimes repeating numbers I'd already passed. Mile marker 67 appeared 3 different times beside the same cluster of aspen and the same distinctive rock formation knifing up from the valley floor. Repetition is the first hymn of a trap. Then came the gas station. I first saw it where my GPS claimed was mile marker 78, a single-story concrete block with 2 ancient pumps and a hand-painted sign that read, "Mountain View Service, closed for repairs." The wide spot might have been a turnout, or just where the highway crew left extra breath in the grade. High-altitude scrub, scattered boulders, thin air that rasped in the lungs. I rolled past, counting on Lake City. 20 minutes later, I passed the same gas station again. Not a twin. The same crack in the concrete foundation. The same broken window on the north side. I pulled over, stepped into a night that smelled like metal and frost, and skimmed my flashlight across the doorframe. The red paint of "closed for repairs" looked tired in exactly the same way. A loop is recognizable the second time through, because you already know where you're about to stand. I tried calling my supervisor, but out here, phones are more superstition than tool. No signal. The GPS continued to show my position on Route 149, but the ETA kept jumping. 45 minutes, 2 hours. An error message like the device couldn't decide if I existed. The radio offered only static on every frequency, not even the usual emergency band that rides the backbone of the state. By the 4th time, I eased past Mountain View service. Denial ran out of road. I was caught in a loop, driving the same section repeatedly without moving the needle. But there was something worse than repetition. The landscape kept changing between passes. Not like memory playing tricks, like a patient hand rearranging furniture in the dark. On one pass, mountain peaks visible on my left. On another, the same peaks stood on my right. Valleys that had worn deep and narrow grew wide and shallow. Creek beds that had paralleled the road suddenly cut across at different angles. It wasn't just that I was circling. It was that the circle was being edited while I was inside it. That's when fear got practical. I decided to wait out the night. The 7th time I encountered the gas station. I nosed the truck by the pumps, killed the lights, and tried to let the seat cradle me into a little mercy. Sleep didn't come. Every time I started to doze, I would hear the sound of vehicles passing on the highway. Not the easy whoosh of ordinary traffic. No, something slower and more deliberate, like heavy machinery operating at very low speeds in the darkness. Think of a crane that forgot it wasn't supposed to travel. Think of weight deciding to move. I got out twice, then a 3rd time. Nothing on the road in either direction. No fresh tire tracks in the light dust on the asphalt. Yet the sound returned, sometimes from the Creed side, sometimes from the Lake City side, as if the work were circling me the way I'd circled it. When nerves fray, you bargain. I told the road I'd leave at first light. I promised the mountains I'd call my family and say I was fine. I promised myself, don't think about how loops end. Dawn washed the rock faces their proper colors. The San Juan Range stepped back into known geometry. My eyes stung with the relief of straight lines behaving like straight lines. Only then did I notice I was parked at a legitimate rest area 15 miles past Lake City, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. I checked my phone, my GPS, my fuel. The gauges now believed in me again. I turned the key and drove out, hunched over the wheel like a man ducking under a question. You don't survive mountain work without theories. In Grand Junction, a week later, I took mine to a guy we all called the Surveyor, a retired DOT hand who'd laid line of sight across more ridges than I've driven. He listened while I told him about the mile markers, counting backward, about Mountain View service, closed for repairs, about the odometer and fuel gauge, stuck. He didn't laugh. He asked one question. Did anything feel under construction? I thought of the heavy machinery sound in the night. I thought of landscape elements swapping sides. Yeah, I said. Like someone was moving the world at 1 mile an hour. He nodded like I'd passed a test. Every state has roads that don't belong to it, he said. Cuts across something older. Some nights, crews come through that no contractor hired. They put the geometry back where it wants to be. You're telling me the highway edits itself? I'm telling you, the 149 you need isn't always the 149 you drive. On those nights, the job site takes precedence over your errand. I wanted superstition to be ridiculous. Instead, it felt like a ledger finally balancing. So what do? You wait. Don't block the turnout. Don't argue with a detour that isn't marked yet. He stared at my hands. You didn't try to fix anything. Did you? I remembered running my fingers along the crack in the foundation at Mountain View Service, the way the red paint flaked beneath my thumb. I touched the building. He winced. Don't touch the work. I went back 3 weekends later, because men who've met a thing like that don't get to ignore it. I picked a clear night and told nobody. Coffee, chains, a new flashlight. I reached Creed at dusk, the town tucked into a valley in the San Juans, the chill already collecting where light wouldn't follow. At mile marker 67, my odometer hiccuped, then behaved. The peaks held their ground. Aspen groves clicked through their own quiet arithmetic. I thought maybe whatever I'd driven through had moved on. Danger is patient. Hope is impulsive. When my GPS began to jump the ETA again, I knew I was being admitted. I slowed where Mountain View Service should be, and there it was. The same single-story concrete block, the same ancient pumps, the same broken window on the north side. This time, I didn't stop. I inched forward until the turnout widened my mirror, then cut the engine and stepped into air that tasted like coins. The sound arrived from the Lake City direction first. Deliberate, heavy, each not quite footfall, dragging enough mass to alter conclusions. The road looked empty. The dust stayed neat. But the station's angle to the highway twitched. A shallow degree you only notice if you're ready to sign an affidavit. If you've ever watched a building slide through options until it chooses itself, you know the feeling of skin that no longer fits. The hand-painted sign blurred and sharpened in a small wind that wasn't there. The aspen cluster shivered one tree at a time. As though being counted, I kept my palms in my pockets. I didn't touch the work. Some edits were obvious. The valley beyond the pumps narrowed until it could have been chiseled by a single intention. The creek bed that had run parallel now crossed the road at a different angle, then, apologetically, moved back. Mile marker 78 winked out, then returned, a coin appearing behind the ear of a child who didn't want to be amused. Other edits were intimate. A distant peak stepped left so the stars could thread between it and its neighbor. The closed for repairs, letters soaked themselves a shade deeper red, then paled, then chose the color of dried blood on a contractor's glove. The broken window healed to a hairline, reconsidered, and broke again on the north side, as if a lesson required repetition. My phone lay face down on the seat of the truck, dead to bars, alive to time. Minutes move differently when you've stopped being the subject of your own sentence. I thought about my family, about the joke they tell. I plan too much. Laugh all you want. The habit kept my hands in my pockets that night. Eventually, the sound changed. Not volume, not pitch. Purpose. The way a crew packs up. The way the last length of rebar goes where it belongs. The station settled by a breath you could only see at the doorframe. The aspen stood counted. The mile marker agreed with the one after it. The geometry signed off. I got in the truck and turned the key. The radio found voices. The GPS decided I existed and was, in fact, boring. I took the first bend without drama. The second delivered me a moon that had been waiting behind a shoulder of rock. At the third, the San Juan Range arranged itself into the map they give to children at visitor centers. I didn't look back. A loop isn't only a shape, it's an invitation to return. I thanked nothing out loud and drove a straight-line journey from Creed to Lake City, or close enough for government work. Weeks later, over coffee, I told the surveyor I hadn't touched anything. He lifted his cup like a benediction. "Then you were a good guest?" "What was the construction?" I asked. He smiled the way old men smile when the answer won't help you. "Whatever it was, kid, it's done. Until the right knight asks for it again." Sometimes, heading west from Lake City toward Gunnison, I think I see a turnout that's wider than it needs to be. Sometimes, a mile marker is fresh paint where everything else is weathered. Sometimes, a valley looks too straight for something carved by water alone. When that happens, I set the cruise at a respectful number and keep my hands where they belong, because I have learned this much. Some roads are not there to take you somewhere. Some nights, you are the thing being delivered. Story number 11. I should have turned around when the GPS went blind. The road ahead wasn't on any official map of Montana. The unmarked gravel path kept threading the pines, then bent into a shadow that felt like a dare. I had less than a quarter tank and no memory of the last sign of civilization. That was the moment the forest started paying attention. My GPS died exactly 3 seconds before I realized the road I'd been following for the past 20 minutes didn't exist on any official map of Montana. The unmarked gravel path stretched ahead through dense lodgepole pine, disappearing around a bend where afternoon shadows turned the woods into something dark and impenetrable. And my fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank, with no memory of when I'd last seen another vehicle or any sign of civilization. I talk a big game about being careful when I'm alone on western highways. Truth is, some mornings pick you up by the collar and tell you you're the type who makes your own shortcuts. That morning, near Highway 2, outside Kalispell, the sky wore a thin skin of weather, the kind that mutters about change. I saw a cutoff that looked clean, promising an hour shaved from the trip to Glacier National Park. And I took it like a man trying on a braver version of himself. I'm usually pretty methodical about these things. Double-check routes, keep the tank full, stick to main highways when traveling alone. But something about the morning had made me feel reckless. Maybe not reckless exactly. Maybe impatient with my own caution. The forest had that after-rain clarity, needles glittering like someone had polished the day for me. The sign at the turnoff was a shrug carved in wood. Forest Service. Road 486. No winter maintenance. Letters so faded, I had to squint. The kind a reasonable person would read twice. I read them once. For the first stretch, the forest pretended to be ordinary. For the first 10 miles, everything felt perfectly normal. Switchbacks, meadows like pauses in a sentence, sun filtering through a green ceiling. I passed a few Forest Service markers and what looked like hunter access points. It suggested this was a legitimate, if lesser used, route. My phone had shown 3 bars of signal when I started, enough to stream music and check messages. Then the climb came. Around mile 12, the bars dropped like a trapdoor, then disappeared entirely as the road shouldered higher into a country that stopped caring about reception. That's when I should have turned around. But the road sold me a series of little promises. A widening ahead, a junction that would mean people, a trailhead where other people might be found. The trees pressed closer, their trunks forming a gate that kept sliding shut behind me. Time seemed to stretch in weird ways. Every turn revealed more of the same dense pine and scattered deadfall. The forest replayed itself, a loop with different punctuation. When the GPS finally gave up, no route found, I pulled into a widened spot that might have been maintenance, might have been neglect. The silence outside my car was absolute. Not the kind that heals, the kind that edits. Like the forest had learned to swallow sound before it could travel more than a few feet. I tried restarting the GPS, checking my phone for even a cough of signal. Got out, squinted through the canopy, hunted the ridgelines for a name I recognized. Nothing except endless trees stretching in every direction. The road behind me looked identical to the road ahead, and I realized, with a precise blade of dread, that I couldn't clearly remember the specific turns I'd made to get here. Forest roads have a way of branching and merging without clear signage. You think you're on a sentence. Turns out you've been walking through footnotes. Every mile I'd driven deeper into this maze had made my situation exponentially more complicated. Forward or back were equally stupid, which is how most bad decisions justify themselves. I chose forward. Most forest roads eventually connect to something. That was the story I told myself. Like a talisman you repeat until it audibly cracks. But the forest began to rewrite the road. The road seemed to become less maintained. The gravel gave way to packed dirt, bitten with ruts. Fallen branches, like punctuation marks, I had to steer around. The timber shifted, too. Older growth blocked out more of the sky. A counterfeit twilight, though it was still mid-afternoon. That's when the rules bent. Trail markers that didn't belong to any system I knew. Posts that counted down rather than up. Clearings where stumps wore tool marks too old for modern equipment. A wrongness that wasn't loud, just relentless. When the building appeared, relief walked out to meet me like an old friend at a station. Any structure meant human presence, directions, a map, the possibility of normal. Up close, the building dropped the mask. Single-story log, collapsed roof, windows boarded up, plywood gone weathered gray, and buckle-backed from seasons of push and pull. The sign out front was a palimpsest, letters thinned to rumor. If hope is a currency, I was paying with coins from a dead empire. Then I saw the cars. They were half hidden behind the building, like memories you try not to notice. A pickup, a sedan, an SUV, parked not in any useful way, but arranged, as if someone had set them down to see how long it would take the forest to memorize their shapes. The license plates were from different states and different decades. The oldest I could make out was from the early 2000s. Windows numbed by condensation, tires flat, vegetation grown up around the wheel wells. Not abandoned so much as absorbed. I let the engine idle and stared, the wheel warm under my grip. Other people had followed this same road, arrived here, and then, what? They left on foot? Found a ranger? Became names in a database flagged inconclusive? The logical explanation was mechanical failure. That's what you say when you want the world to keep making sense. But the scene felt deliberate, arranged. A still life titled Collection. And the thought that I might be joining this automotive graveyard made my hands shake as I put my car in reverse and edged back over the rutted road toward the version of the forest I thought I knew. That was when the soundlessness changed. It didn't break. No grand report. It tightened, like a room drawing breath. The pines leaned in without moving. I checked the mirror and found the bend I'd come around had drifted, as if the road's spine had realigned. It wasn't a trick of light. The ruts behind me weren't my ruts. I eased the shifter into drive again, rolled forward to test the world, then back to test it again. Each time, the geometry moved by a finger's width, too small to prove, too large to dismiss. A mile away, or a lifetime, was Highway 2 and the life where I made conservative choices. Here, the forest had decided I was interesting. I picked a point on a trunk, a blister of sap, a lightning scar, and used it as a compass rose. Drove toward it, slow enough to count my own pulse. The sap blister slipped left when it should have steadied. I kept going anyway, because the other option was to park and wait for a story to happen to me. I've never liked being cast. Time seemed to stretch in weird ways again, but this time it had a purpose. The light grew denser, closer to amber than gold. The needles took on a lacquered glare, and the air smelled like sweetened rot. When the next clearing opened, it wasn't a clearing. It was a circle, a ring of boulders squatted in the grass like sentence stops. In the center, a char stain old enough to forget its flame. I left the engine on and stepped out. The quiet stayed pinned to me, a cloak thrown over a chair. Sound seemed to get swallowed by the trees. The boulders bore notches, smooth from use, not from water. The char was laced with bone-white flecks I didn't catalog. On the far side of the ring, a post like the others rose from the ground, numbered. The number shouldn't have been any number. It was -1. I walked back to the car and placed both hands on the hood, as if to warm them. That's when the forest knocked, not on the window, not on the hood, on the shape of the day. Somewhere close, a branch didn't crack. It decided to no longer. It attached. A cone detached without falling. I looked up to see gravity forget itself for a beat. Then remember, in slow motion. I got back in, closed the door, and felt the handle finish closing a breath after the latch. I chose a direction that wasn't the direction I came from, and wasn't the direction the road wanted. The tires pressed into packed dirt with deeper ruts, the car rocking like a boat testing a mooring. Washouts yawned like cautions, written in a language I could fake but not speak. I threaded them, eyes skipping from mirror to windshield. Every few hundred yards, an artifact, a tool head without a handle, a bottle lipped with ash, a boot print too crisp for its age. And then, as if bored with the long game, the forest made me an offer. A sound arrived. Not animal, not weather, a generator's steady heart, far enough that it came through the trunks as a hum laid on top of the silence. Civilization, whispered the part of me that still believed in systems. I followed it, like a man follows his own name, down a hallway. It led me to a second building. This one wasn't old. It was worse, new enough that someone had wanted it to look like a ranger outpost, painted in the right green, windows set at the right proportions, but wrong. The dimensions were fractions off. The flag bracket held nothing. The porch steps were a ladder cut sideways. The generator sat behind, purring without cables. The door had a handle, but no latch hardware. It was a stage set for people who think about people. I didn't knock. I said my name into the air like a password. The air didn't return it. I backed away, and the generator faltered a single beat, as if counting me. I got in the car and did the only thing left that felt like an action. I turned the wheel until the steering fought me. Then I drove the logging track, not meant for cars, the one that bowed upslope toward the kind of slope you apologize to transmissions for. The old growth thickened. The twilight fitted itself closer. The hum cut out. Behind me, the fake outpost remained a shape you can only see in a rearview mirror, an idea somewhere in the climb. I realized I'd stopped thinking in miles. I was measuring in bends, in widened spots, in numbers that counted down rather than up. The last number I saw before the ridge was 0. Something always happens at 0. The ridge didn't crest. It paused. I rolled onto a shelf of ground where the trees stepped back, and for the first time since mile 12, the sky found me. It wasn't sky like a ceiling. It was sky like a door you can't open from your side. The sun sat flatter than it should have. Color burned to copper, as if evening had been pressed between glass. Down below, in the valley I'd just climbed out of, I could see the ghost of the road, thin, pale, vanishing when I blinked. In that pale thread, shapes marked the places I had stopped. A wider scrape where I'd stared at a map that didn't help. A darker pane where the forest had leaned in. I could also see the abandoned building and the vehicles, if I wanted to. Which I didn't. There was a choice up here, carved into the shelf by tire memory. Left. The path curled along the contour, staying social with the ridge, careful not to lose altitude. Right. The path straightened and dove, braver, dumber, honest. I went right. The steering wheel felt lighter, which is not a sentence a mechanic would endorse. The descent stretched like a sentence you keep adding commas to. The trees down here were a different species of tall, not lodgepole, something older, shouldered with burl. Bark ran in twisted cords, as if the trunks had grown around wire left from a previous owner. The ground smell changed from pine duff to something mineral, a quarry of odor. The air cooled the way air cools near water. But there was no water. I caught a flicker in the corner of my eye, a white square fixed 3 trees in, not facing the road. The kind of posted notice that tells you what you're not allowed to do. I braked and eased the car to the shoulder that pretended to be there. Walked in. The notice was blank, not painted over, not bleached. Blank. Factory perfect, never printed. 4 nails, corners precisely placed. A vacancy framed like a portrait. I laughed, because the other option was to count my breathing. Back in the car, I told the road a story about how this would end. Most forest roads eventually connect to something. Even wrong roads fold into right ones if you keep going forward. You'll hit a highway, a ranger station, a campground, a noun with people attached. I promised the car a gas station where I'd buy it a drink and call it even. The road caught me in the lie. It delivered me to pavement. Not a lot of pavement. A remnant. A 2-lane torn down to a single lane by time and weather. Centerline faint as old chalk. But it was blacktop, which in the language of lost things translates to home. I whooped, quietly, because the forest still had its hand on the fader, and took the right turn that felt like east. 2 minutes later, the pavement ended in a barricade. Crossbars, reflectors, the whole language of no. But the reflectors didn't reflect. I parked and walked up. The barricade had weight without substance. The crossbars were painted metal that weighed like wood, that felt like paper. I pressed a palm to the nearest reflector. It was warm. Around the base, vegetation had grown up in a ring too disciplined for chance. I checked for a bypass. Someone always cuts a path around a barricade. There was one, and it was recent. Grasses pressed. Print of a tire with a pebble signature. I followed it. Came back with a mouth full of the taste you get when a battery dies in your hand. The car started on the first turn. I took the bypass slow. The washouts on this side were a different dialect. Neater. As if curated. Past the barricade, the pavement returned, and with it, a sign. A real one. Green enamel. White letters. Kalispell. 22. Highway 25. That's what it should have said. What it said was Kalippell. 2.highway. Prod. The blanks weren't damage. They were omissions. Kept places. Stored for later. I kept driving. Because that's what you do when a reasonable world is one good sign away. The fuel gauge coughed its opinion. I told it we'd be fine. The trees thinned. The land shouldered open to fields that had been fields for a long time. Old fences drooped their wire smiles. A barn with a missing side took the light like a well. I could almost feel the phone in my pocket, remember signal. Then I saw the pickup from behind the abandoned building, parked clean on the shoulder with a triangle of hazard set up behind it. The truck wore the same plate, the same scabs of rust, the same dent over the wheel well. The triangle was new. A man stood by the open hood, waving in the universal semaphore of need a hand. He was my age, or the age I was pretending to be. Flannel faded to comfort, cap bleached by honest work. His face was normal, where you expect a face to be normal. His eyes were the exact color of the trees at a distance. I slowed, rolled the window. "You good? Could use a jump," he said. His voice had the grain of weekday radio. "Battery's a wanderer." I looked at the hazard triangle. New plastic always carries its own weather. "You alone out here? Not if you're here." He smiled, like someone invoking a rule. "You know the way to Highway 2? I was hoping you did." He nodded, thoughtful at the wrong speed. "It's just around the next bend." There it was. That phrase. That candy. Just around the next bend. The same promise the road had made all day. The forest is nothing if not consistent. I put the car in park and popped the trunk. He leaned in as if to measure the distance between us and a story we would both agree on. I lifted the jumper cables and saw, on the inside face of my trunk lid, a numbered post stencil. Not a sticker. Not paint. A shadow in the metal that moved when the car breathed. -2. I closed the trunk quietly, like a person leaving a sleeping child. "I'm going to roll on," I said, cable still in my hand. "But I'll call somebody as soon as I have bars." He tipped his cap like a man taught by someone who cared. You do that. He stepped back from the truck, hands visible, posture patient. The hazard triangle looked pleased with itself. I drove. The bend arrived, and like all promises, it kept itself by not being itself. The bend unbent. The road behind me looked identical to the road ahead. No route found, said the black screen of the dash where the map should live. I didn't panic. Panic is a waste of burnable fuel. I did math. Gallons to miles, miles to hope. I did ritual. Restart the GPS, count to 8. Offer up the minor prayer of signal. Nothing except endless trees in the side glass. Even here, where the fields pretended at comfort. When the next widened spot presented itself, I took it, turned the wheel until the car faced the way I had just come. Put my car in reverse. The man and the pickup were not in the mirror. The hazard triangle was, it sat precisely where no triangle had been. A red geometry at the edge of the road, patient as winter. On its face, in white, someone had written a number. It wasn't 3 sides anymore. It had a bottom, -3. I backed around it and found forward again. A mile later, 2 triangles faced each other beyond a drainage dip, like teeth. Between them, a post without a number. The forest had outsourced its counting. I stopped playing. I drove until the fuel gauge was an accusation. I drove until the evening unlocked itself into actual evening, and the world's copper cooled to nickel. I drove until the older growth stepped back, and the mixed pine and fir returned, and the air lost the quarry and took back the mountain. I drove until the bars on the phone staggered to their feet. I pulled to the gravel and called the ranger district. A woman answered in a voice that had answered worse. I told her my name, my turnoff, my mistakes. I told her what I'd seen without telling her the part where the numbers went negative. She asked me to stay put. She said a unit was near. She said people get turned around out there. She said Flathead National Forest has roads that branch and merge and sometimes steal your good intentions for a few hours. While I waited, the silence did not return to normal. It held, respectful of the call in my ear. Headlights slid out of the dusk like a decision. The ranger truck's paint was the right green. The windows, the right proportion. The woman who stepped down wore the face of competence. Her patch said her name. Her eyes said mine. You're lucky, she said gently. We've had folks follow Forest Service Road 486 to places no winter maintenance should be the least of your worries. Is there an abandoned building up there? I asked. With vehicles behind it? She looked past me at the trees, as if they were telling their side. There was. Her mouth weighed the tents. We posted it years back. People still find it. What happens to the cars? Tow when we can. She met my eyes again. Sometimes we can't. She told me to follow. I did. We drove around the next bend, then the next, and then there was the real sign in the real world. White letters with no blanks. Kalispell, 22, Highway 2, 5. I checked it twice because I am, on most days, a reasonable man. At the junction, she waved me through and touched her brim. The gesture was old enough to trust. I pulled onto Highway 2 and let the speed limit feel like grace. In the rear view, the forest was a dark thought you decide not to finish. That night, I parked at a motel that burned its vacancy in honest neon. In the room, I opened the curtains to let the highway's noise keep me company. I took the phone in my hand and watched the bars sit steady. I slept badly, but I slept in the morning. I checked the car. The trunk lid bore no stencil. The hazard triangle I didn't own was not in the back. The fuel gauge was a plain fact. The map showed roads where roads should be, on the drive out of town. I passed a wooden sign with faded letters that said no winter maintenance. Below it, someone had tacked another sign. New vinyl, black on yellow. Count starts at 0. I didn't take the turn. I kept going until the day forgot to watch me.